We'll do it live. Okay. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irita TV. We're playing around with our opening, and we heard Bill O'Reilly, but we didn't see Bill O'Reilly this time. So sorry about that. We'll have it figured out next time. But again, we're doing it live. This is Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irita TV. I am back from Hawaii. I think the Pacific Northwest has already eliminated all signs of any tan that I had. So Washington State will do that too here, particularly in the winter. However, we're back, and we're excited. Nima, it's December 12th, 2022, yep. And I feel pretty good. You know, everybody's all butthurt about the election and stuff still, and that the fact that the world, they think, is coming to an end. But I feel pretty good. How do you feel?
I feel good too. Yeah, I mean, there's bad things happen in the world, and we gotta deal with it. And it's just a constant theme of humanity, if you will.
Right. I mean, as ridiculous as things are, you and I aren't fighting in fucking trenches right now. We're not starving to death. Like,
right.
We're able to connect to each other across the country to talk to anybody who fucking wants to tune in with the internet connection. So things could be worse.
Right.
Things could be worse. And, right now, two things seem to be what everybody's all butthurt about, at least in this sphere of stuff that I look into, is the cheating. Oh, excuse me, no, the honking. We're on YouTube. There's no cheating. There's no cheating anywhere. Just some totally normal election stuff. People are really mad about the totally normal election stuff happening right now. And I don't see why, because it's totally normal, which is what we're required to say on YouTube. And the fact that Elon Musk is simultaneously going through Twitter like a bull through a china shop, and the far right is just so upset about the fact that he isn't bullying hard enough through that china shop, and it's just totally cracking me up.
Right.
And the thing that's the funniest for me, as someone who has recently acquired a business, right, is that Elon Musk acquires Twitter, and I guess he's not the richest man in the world now. He's the second richest man in the world. But he's got this experience of just, merging and acquiring companies left and right. The guy might know what he's doing, right? He gets in there, he acquires this business, things start happening, and all these fucking peanut gallery people are just like, Elon Musk doesn't know what he's doing. He's getting there, and he's going to fail because of this. He's going to fail because of that.
I told you guys. I told you he wasn't going to change a thing. I was right. Ha, 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 ha.
Yep.
Look at me.
And then he paid $44 billion for this, and he's going to lose all this money because Twitter's only making this much. But, yeah, you know what the fuck you're doing. Right, you know what it's like to buy a company with what Twitter had 7,500 employees or something when he walks in. You know exactly how to handle that. Yeah,
it's a bunch of journal school graduates trying to tell Elon Musk how to do business, which is bizarre. But these people have no humility.
Well, so I mean, let's look at what Twitter was, right? Twitter was, this. It wasn't just a propaganda machine, because, we got Twitter, we got Facebook, and we got YouTube are kind of the three big ones. Am I missing one? In terms of the global communication networks that we have right now, those are the big three, right?
Facebook, Google, Twitter.
And I think Twitter might be the smaller of the three, but it's one of the big ones, right? And so not only was it, propagating propaganda. It's making sure people can't talk, right? Because that's one of the big three. So we shut it down there. People can't talk. And even though, we're reaching out into these alternative spheres, it still had the momentum of the prestige of saying, well, because we can control what trends here, we could still largely control whatever the conversation is. even though there was a battle, right? So that's what it was. Elon Musk comes in. The first fucking day fires that Indian Parag.
And the Vijay Gaddy also.
Yeah. All these guys are out. He sends out the tweet about, like, if you're not ready to work fucking 16 hours a day, get the fuck out of here. And which is brilliant, right? I mean, how do you quickly figure out who's costing you money for nothing? Right? You know, if you walk into a business that you just bought, you don't walk in and immediately change everything the first fucking day. Why don't you do that, Nima?
Right.
Because you don't know what's going on. You got to figure out what's going on before you.
I mean, I actually thought that it would take him much longer. I mean, I'm not Elon Musk, but I've had some experience running companies and stuff, and I thought that he would have to keep that CEO on for at least half a year or so. But
just because he knew what to do, right?
We're right. I mean, if you understand the problems with technology, you understand that the people in charge are the people who the specialists who
they know what levers to pull.
Technology,
right? They know what levers.
It's not necessarily top level. It's not the lowest people, but the middle management people are oftentimes, you know, more powerful than the top guy. I mean, we've seen that with even now when Musk tried to share the Twitter files, there was some asshole FBI agent still at Twitter curating the Twitter files on behalf of the FBI, presumably.
Right. Switch us back to video. Nima, I don't know if you know when you share like that. I don't have the screen of us, so we're just staring at Twitter when you do that. We'll figure that out soon. I've got this fancy doohickamafuck, right, that I can program to do all sorts of things, but I haven't gotten smart enough to figure out how to program it to do the things that I want yet. So we'll work with what we got. But the other big crack up is like, so Elon Musk releases something, and from the left they're screaming and dying, and from the right they're just like, this isn't enough. If he was really a free speech absolutist, he would have done this. And it's like, well, I don't know if he's a free speech absolutist, like, because he's still, you know, doing the hate speech stuff, and he's still trolling some lines from the ADL and whatever, right? You know, he's meeting with Jonathan Greenblatt, and they're like, see, he's still controlled. Yeah. Okay, however, Twitter is never ever gonna be the free speech absolute zone, that utopia that you have in your dreams, right? Well, it's not gonna be Gab.
I think I was prepared for like a full-on sabotage from all the suppliers that a company like Twitter depends on. Network companies, ISPs, infrastructure companies, contractors,
banks,
etc.
Yeah, like
banks.
Well, you know, we're not going to do banking with you anymore, Elon.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I'm even prepared for stuff. I mean, he said it himself too. Things are going to get really stupid here for a little while I figure things out. And there are things that I find interesting. You know, I've never seen so many left-wing shills that I've never followed, and about whom I've told Twitter specifically, I'm not interested in seeing any more tweets from this person. I keep seeing more left-wing content than I've ever seen before on Twitter. So there's obviously something that needs to be figured out, but at the same time, I'm not pessimistic. I'm not, mad at Elon. Maybe, that's one thing. The other thing is obviously our sister account, Dissent Watch. There was supposed to be an amnesty for...
a general amnesty.
Suspended accounts. That hasn't happened yet, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think I did see him tweet that it's happening slowly. And the Babylon Bee made a article, of which I only read the headline, is something like Elon Musk promises to do general amnesty and release all the papers as soon as he figures out where all these red dots are coming from.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, imagine you're in his shoes, and the Twitter is involved in keeping the global hegemonic network together, right? It's not the whole thing, but it's a big chunk of the whole thing. And Elon Musk comes in, and regardless of whether he's on Team Illuminati Overlord or not, the fact that he's shaking it up is an issue for them, right? And so, like Nima was just saying, I can't believe that Elon hasn't gotten the Kanye West treatment yet.
Yeah.
Right? And not because Elon's coming out and describing a group of people that shall not be named. Just because he's shaking it up, and I mean, you look at okay, he won't bring Infowars back, but he's bringing back fuck, I already forgot some of the people he brought back off the top of my head. He's bringing people back, and the leftists are freaking out, going, "This is violence! Oh my God! Elton John rage quits Twitter because the guy fucking still exists, and I never listened to his music anyway." Except maybe it was on like a movie soundtrack or something, right? I agree with Nima. The fact that he's moving at the speed that he's moving, you have to take what you could get, right? We're in like this information war. I guess think about it this way. Imagine an actual war in like medieval times, right? Like the Mongols are invading or some shit, right? And maybe not the Mongols because they were so superior they just wiped everybody out. But we're fighting with this enemy, and we're like capturing cities back and forth. You know, maybe this is the Crusades or something. We're capturing cities back and forth. And then the neighboring city is caught by the enemy, and this third party, this third army comes in that we're unsure of the alliances are. They come in and they invade the city. They take control of it. And they start doing some stuff that actually benefits us. Right? Now, do you take the things that benefit you and run with it, or are you like, well, he's not doing 100% of the things. He's not swearing fealty to our side. Therefore, he's our enemy, and we should never, ever trust him and throw out the baby with the bath. I mean, like, that's how stupid you guys sound, right? We're in a war. He's doing something that benefits us. Take it and fucking run. Shit.
Yeah. It's what's been going on, I would say, maybe since 2015 or 2016, is that there's a new community of, I wouldn't say journalists, but up until that time, it was basically the corporate media was dominating everything, Hollywood was dominating everything, and they were the community that debates the authorized topics and that delivers the acceptable talking points to the public. And what has been forming in a very chaotic manner since then is a new community that does not have that status yet to the average person out there. It doesn't have the status of, these are the people who talk about the things that are important to you. Mm-hmm. And people like Musk, by going on these Twitter spaces, inviting people to have a conversation, inviting COVID skeptics, Musk and other people as well, but Musk right now, this is like a wrecking ball to the established community.
Right, just the ability to speak about it, right? I'm just back you up.
Because he's the richest man in the world or something like that, and he has he has built Tesla, which is a very popular company worldwide. He is somebody who says things that a lot of people will find more acceptable than when somebody else says it. And he's bringing together all the people whom we were told we're not supposed to listen to during the lockdowns. And I mean, we can talk about
lockdowns or whatever,
so many different spheres where there's people whom we're not allowed to listen to. And Elon Musk, by being this figure and by going on these spaces, inviting the skeptics, the critics, the dissidents, I think it's a big step towards creating a new community that gives people a different perspective, but it's coming from an acceptable source and not a source that people are told, "Ew, don't go there."
You found that under a rock. Ugh.
Right. Yeah.
Ugh.
And that's obviously going to be a messy process, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of felt like that about Donald Trump as well. not saying, whatever he has become now, it's probably a different discussion. But when he first was elected president, he took a wrecking ball to the established narrative, and topics that were never allowed to discuss are now mainstream because of that.
Right.
Doesn't mean that he did great things overall, but in terms of just for the narrative and for the discussion in public, I think these are wrecking balls, and it creates chaos. And we have to pick up the pieces and make something.
Well, and we
useful.
are. And thank you for bringing up Donald Trump, because so we can look back, whether it's his presidency, whether it's the 2020 election, whether it's the midterms or whatever that's going on now, whether he's going to run in 24 or whatever. I think it's really important not to get wrapped up in the mystique of the individual, right? Donald Trump did this or Donald Trump did that, or he intends this or he intends that, or he has these allies that are bad, or he has these allies that are good, or whatever. To Nima's point, he created the wrecking ball. I mean, the fact that we're even having these discussions and the political atmosphere and the energy is even moving in a certain direction,
right.
He was largely responsible for that.
Right.
Now, again, whatever Donald Trump is doing, or whatever he's gonna do that. You don't control that.
Yeah. I mean, so what do you
gonna do
from a wrecking ball? It's like a wrecking ball's gonna do what a wrecking ball does, and nothing beyond that. He's not gonna propose the perfect solutions. He's not necessarily going to do everything in an intelligent manner. But
who cares? Yeah.
Right. He did the thing that the wrecking balls do. He took a wrecking ball to aspects of the existing narrative and the existing acceptable community.
Well, and he did two things, which I think have benefited us all greatly. First, he won. Then he lost. And again, we're on YouTube, so he lost fair and square. Honk, honk, wink, wink. He won, which for me personally, I mean, you could say it's Illuminati all over control and everything, and I'm just, an idiot or something thinking this, but I believed that everything was so controlled that, for the voting, the Illuminati overlords hit a button, this person won, and hit a button, and that person won, and it was just completely all manufactured. And the fact that Donald Trump came out and won showed me that there is an actual system of people doing actual work, and work needs to be done to achieve the thing, and if the opposite side does work, they can also achieve a different thing, which means there is a reason to resist. Right, but before that, I'm black-pilled, I guess is a term that we use these days. We didn't have that term back then, right? Is that what's the point of resisting? Because it's all controlled, right? Then once he won, and I fell into this category too, we all sat back and go, okay, he won,
right?
Let him fix everything,
right?
Great, right?
And then, oh no, he's not fixing everything.
He's not fixing everything. I got my beer and my TV and my computer screen, right? And my gaming chair or my lazy boy, right? And I'm watching and saying, oh, Donald Trump should be doing this or that. Then he lost. And I think it's wonderful that he lost, because had he won, we all would have still been armchair quarterbacks. Right?
Right.
Because whatever's happening in that level, unless you really gain a lot of power, you don't really affect that. You affect things in your sphere.
Again, that power comes from having, creating this community that can deliver that can deliver information to the common man. That's ultimately where the power comes from, right?
Well, that's half of it. The second half is you got to do something with that information, right? Which is something that we try to proliferate on the show and encourage on the show.
The information creates the framework within which we can actually do things. Without that, if the people their eyes aren't open, then you can't do those things. Even if you have
you've got to
lots of money,
you got to be
whatever.
able to imagine it first before you do it, right? However, once imagining it, you have to step in and actually do the thing. Right, yeah. And to that effect, we're all not we, you and I, but the general conservative side is all butthurt about the most recent election because we didn't get the red wave that we were promised, and maybe honks happened and maybe they didn't. However, at the local level, things are getting swept. At the school board level, things are getting swept. And then, I mean, even looking at at least in Washington State, I presume that this is happening in the other states.
Here in Miami, absolutely. The school board in Miami was absolutely changed into a different direction after the recent election.
Well, and the Republican Party here is getting... they're doing their reorganization votes. That's what I'm saying. I'm sure this is happening either now or sometime around now in all these other states. Is that all the party membership at the precinct level got revoted in, and right now in December and in January, all the counties reelect their leadership, and out of that leadership, 3 of them go to the state committee that controls the party leadership at the state level. Well, the rhinos are getting slaughtered. In my county, the whole leadership just got thrown out, and I'm communicating with other counties where the leadership left and right is just getting completely thrown out, and all these rhino motherfuckers are just getting replaced. And what this is telling me is that the bottom is swelling up, which again, Donald Trump's going to do whatever the hell Donald Trump's going to do, and maybe he's going to save the world, and maybe he isn't, but what are you doing? How are you getting involved? What power sphere do you have, and how are you projecting it, right?
It has to come bottom up, exactly.
Yeah, and so Nima's got this school board article up. Changes coming to Miami-Dade school board after wins by 2 DeSantis-endorsed candidates, right?
Yeah, and especially recently there was a vote where they just voted down CRT, actually LGBTQ. Like they wanted to make the entire month of October LGBTQ month, and they were going to get it under the previous school board,
but now it got shit canned.
And even people actually. The activism here was so successful on the grassroots level. Even the Democrat candidates on that school board weren't having it anymore. They voted against the LGBT. So they saw that, it's acceptable to vote against it. So they did it, and we got rid of LGBTQ in the schools in Miami.
Well, and then going back to Center for Self-Governance talk, which is to say, okay, this LGBTQ stuff in the schools is actually a symptom and not a cause. The cause is that parents are not seen as the primary stakeholders in their children's upbringing, right? The state is, or the WEF is, or whatever, depends on whatever your state law says. And the parents show up to the school board meetings, and at the federal level, they're terrorists because of the way that the law is written there. And at the local level, they're nowhere on the list of stakeholders, and so they walk into these school board meetings jumping and shouting, and all this, the school looks at them going, well, who the fuck are you? You don't have any stakeholdership here.
Just to
right?
Just to quantify here, so in 2021 they affirmed this resolution by a 7-1 vote, and now it was voted 1-8 against it.
Any way the wind blows doesn't really matter to me, huh? Oh, it's popular now? Okay, we'll do it. Oh, it's not popular now? Oh, okay, we changed our minds. Right. But that's how it works. That's how it works, right? So, I mean, I think this is a perfect example. You can jump up and down and say, okay, democracy is bad, even though this is republicanism or whatever. Democracy is bad, and this is proof. And these people just blow whichever way the wind blows, and they have no brains, they have no balls. They just follow whatever's popular. Good, then control them. Shit.
Right, then. That's what I'm saying. Then create the community that creates the narrative that makes people change their minds.
Right.
By the way, did we want to discuss this paper today, or
I don't know. How much? How many minutes are we into this? Well, let me wrap one thing up before we change subjects, Nima. I want to say this. I was talking about CSG. So Mark Hare, who we've had on several times, who teaches the CSG courses, which a CSG course is being taught tonight because Steve Dunkel, motherfucker, in Mason County, Washington, won the auditor race. We have a favorable auditor in the state of Washington. There is a wedge in Washington to make the perfectly legitimate election system that has no flaws in it whatsoever,
Even more
in the cleanest, best voting state in the country, even better.
Wow, that's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
Because it is already great, obviously.
Right,
I
so
love the
so we're forming. It's gonna be good. So anyway, but on the CSG level in Washington State, the school boards. I don't think we had any elections of school boards now, but we had them the previous year. The school boards are getting more and more tapped into this idea of parents as the primary stakeholders, and they're pushing it, and the state apparatuses, in this case WASDA and OSPA. Office of the Superintendent of Public, whatever. You don't even know what they are. They're freaking out because these individual places are getting control. The individual school boards are getting control like they were designed to, despite the fact that the Leviathan of Charles Merriam's Marble Cake Factory, if you don't know what that is, watch our interviews with Mark Hare. Charles Merriam's Marble Cake Factory, Leviathan, has reached its tentacles in to erode the barriers of between different forms of government. Despite that happening left and right, the school boards are starting to take control. And once they start to take control and the barriers go back, there isn't one individual political power that can control everything, and then it's not so important who gets voted in because they can't get all the fucking power. Okay, Nima, change the subject.
Well, just to add to that, the United States has this advantage of having this seven-boundary republic, which actually allows for a lot of screw-ups, right? That's the beauty of it. You can have a lot of people in a lot of position doing really bad policy, and it doesn't really matter as much because there's all these boundaries in place.
And the governments, the individual governments can fight each other, right?
Yeah, and compete. Yeah, they can compete.
I mean, we think about the state and the federal, which fights all the time, but even the city can fight the state, or the city can fight the federal, the county can fight the. Excuse me. I got sick like a month ago, and I still haven't gotten rid of the cough. Blah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Anyway, so Nima wanted to change the subject. I'm done harping on that one. Please do so.
Okay.
We're gonna get philosophical here. And
We're done
religious.
with current events.
Yeah.
We're gonna discuss a paper called The Contingency of Knowledge and Revelatory Theism. What does that mean? I guess I could, to simplify it, does God exist or not?
Right, well, and I guess we should preface this a little bit because me and Nima have been getting into this more and more and more. And I think a lot there has been a reaction to the materialism that's being pushed. I think largely because the leftists have been pushing it so hard, which is kind of the nature of the Marxist tradition of leftism, right? Is this blanched materialism? But Nima and I have been having a lot of private discussions about this, and we just found it interesting enough to chat about. And I mean, to paraphrase this paper, if you look at the first sentence here, it says there are fundamentally two different ways to understand the world, which is intentional and accidental, which anybody with two brain cells to rub together is, did God create the world or did it just happen by itself, is basically what this guy's talking about, right?
Exactly.
And Nima, I know you like to read stuff, but I don't want to read 14 pages of this. I think we can paraphrase it pretty well. The gist of the argument, I was reading it last night, although at 2 a.m, I was working late. I was like, I'm not digesting any of this.
I vote for let's read it.
Okay, well, I think that the only way to solve it then is a mud wrestling match, because we're 50-50 now. Okay, how about this? Read the first paragraph and so let's see how we go. Yeah, okay. So, but we have switched into the existence of God after the Twitter sphere and elections. So, Nima, go.
Yeah. Okay. Introduction. There are two fundamentally different ways to understand the world, intentional and accidental. An intentional world is one that comes about on purpose and for a purpose. It is a world that is what it is because someone intended for it to be that way. In contrast, an accidental world is one that comes about by pure chance, for no purpose and for no reason. It is a world that is what it is by accident. All worldviews are, at bottom, either intentional or accidental. So do we agree so far that this is basically a binary choice, right?
Well, and,
there's no third option.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we sit here and think of a third option?
I mean,
the closest thing I can think of is the deist argument, right? Which is that, okay, God did create everything, but he created everything and he took a step back and he lets it run by itself. Maybe that's
which still means it's an intentional world.
It's an intention. Okay, yeah, I can follow that. All right.
So yeah, there are different gradations under the intentional side of things. And we're not going to solve that. What we're trying to solve with this paper is just the basic question: is the world created by a creator, or did it come about by something like a Big Bang, molecules, electrons?
Well, accidental. There's things, they're here, we don't know why. Everything just bumps into itself accidentally, somehow, through something that we can't use the term miraculous. We can't use the term miraculous, but I'm going to use the term miraculous. Miraculously, broke all the laws of probability that life was able to form on Earth and probably doesn't exist anywhere else in the universe because the math doesn't make sense.
Right. The navel lint theory of the formation of planets, basically. It's like, when sometimes you have navel lint and you don't know where it came from. And
no, navel, like your belly button. Got it. Yeah. Not like boats on the seas, right?
That's the theory of accidentalism or whatever you want. Let's move on here because these two kinds of worldviews describe very different worlds. They tell different stories about how the world came to be, about the nature of the world, and about the nature of man. They give different accounts. They give different accounts regarding a man's relationship to the world and how the world can be known by man. These two accounts of man's knowledge present us with two very different epistemological stories. The first story is of an epistemology. By the way, epistemology is, of course, the study of knowledge. How do we know? Basically, philosophy is roughly divided in two branches: metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics is about what's reality, what's outside of our heads, and epistemology is what's inside of our heads. And how do we know?
And epistemology is how we know what's out there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on your metaphysics, right? Because there are people who say there is no reality, so there's nothing out there. So in that case, we'll get there. The first story is of an epistemology in which man is aided. It is an epistemology that is grounded not by man, but by someone who is in a position to know. It is grounded by God. It is a theonomous epistemology.
I think he made that word up, theonomous.
The second story is of an epistemology in which man is not aided. It is an epistemology that is grounded in man and by man. It is an autonomous epistemology. As we look at these two stories, we will make a disquieting discovery. We will find that the second story is not true.
Spoiler alert! The paper's biased. We'll address that.
For the history of epistemology demonstrates that man, unaided, has not and cannot attain a foundation on which to base a theory of knowledge. We will see that any theory of knowledge that originates solely from man must be characterized as arbitrary, ambiguous, and incoherent. But if man has no coherent theory of knowledge, then his beliefs are without warrant. And if his beliefs are without warrant, then he can make no claim to be in the possession of knowledge.
So basically, it's not super heavy, but this paper's a little heavy in philosophy babble.
It
right.
gets
and I think I just want to summarize that, which is to say he's claiming, he's going to make the argument that epistemology that removes God from the picture, a metaphysics and epistemology that removes God from the picture, is inherently contradictory.
Yes.
Yeah.
If, however, the story of autonomous epistemology is not true, we will have to make a choice. We will either have to accept the lesson of history and resign ourselves to utter skepticism and ignorance, or we will have to accept our first story and seek aid as to the foundations of epistemology. But we will need to seek aid from someone who does not share our limitations. We will need aid from someone who does not share our struggle to understand what the world is, what he himself is, and how he and the world are epistemically related. We will need aid from someone who is not also entangled with the paradox of providing a justification criterion for his justification criterion. We will need aid from someone who is in a position to know. He is in a position to know because he does not stand on our side of the world, but stands in back of it. We will need aid from God. I think I'll just keep reading because
I'll interrupt you when it's the right time.
Yeah, because if there's things that are unclear right now, we'll get into all these things in the subsequent paragraphs. So, first of all, the theonomous epistemology. This is the God, the argument for God, basically. Our first story goes like this. Once upon a time, there were those who believed that fundamental reality was one. This one, they believed, was personal, all-powerful, all-rational, and exceedingly creative. But they did not think this belief to be an arbitrary metaphysical speculation. Rather, it is their testimony that the One has revealed this to them. They believed this revelation was true because it explained a great many things. I explained the problem of the One and the many. Because everything in the universe is what the One intended it to be, nothing is what it is by chance. Consequently, every object in the universe is united, not by an infinitely improbable accident, but necessarily. Because the many particulars of man experience all originate from the One, they are by definition related to one another. Consequently, man's philosophical and scientific description of those relationships are not mere fictitious, but are real and meaningful.
So, again, to summarize that, is he's basically saying if God created reality, then there's meaning to reality.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there's an account for reality. Because the One is rational, logic has an absolute reference.
Stop there. I think that's very interesting. Right? I think that this is where it really, really gets interesting, is to say rationality and logic is something that naturally flows from the idea that a God created everything.
Yes. Because logic is universal. The laws of logic are universal, and we have no explanation for
why
logic.
Universalities should exist.
Right. And why logic is logic only valid in my head, or is it only valid right now and not tomorrow? Was it always valid? The empiricist would say, well, at least the empiricist in me would say, well, logic is just an observation of the consistency of matter and energy in the universe. But then again, what is the consistency of matter and energy in the universe?
Yeah, you didn't observe consistency, right?
Well,
how did you come to the concept of consistency if you didn't have a universal idea to work with in the first place?
Well, first of all, but also, so I can observe from empirical observation that experiments verify that matter and energy is consistent. However, who said that that's the right way of proving logic? It's it's arbitrary. I made it up, basically. Mm-hmm. That's it. We'll get to those challenges. Because the One is rational, logic has an absolute referent. And because rationality extends to everything the One has done, it is universal. Mind and matter are appropriate to one another. The categories of thought correspond to the categories of reality. Man's mental processes correspond to physical processes. Survival, science, and philosophy are possible. A thing in itself can be known. Because the One created man in his own image, man transcends the deterministic nexus of the material world. The human mind is not a mere physical object locked into the great machine of the universe, where thoughts are nothing more than brain states, the mere products of antecedent causes, neither true nor false. Man transcends nature and is related to it as a subject.
So I think this is so important, right? And Nima's heard me talk about this more than you've probably heard you talk about it on the show, which I want to rectify for the future. But when it comes to the argument of free will versus determinism, right, is that if you wander down the road of determinism, you very quickly get in these circular arguments on both sides, which nobody gets anywhere. I step back from those arguments and think about it this way, is that if the universe is 100% deterministic, which includes me and Nima and everybody else, anybody who has a soul that's supposed to be capable of making choices, right, that aren't just on this automated process, is if that's true, no such thing as responsibility exists. Nobody can be responsible for anything. And so the whole idea of morality and justice and ethics and all that stuff, you can just completely throw it out the window, because if a rock falls onto the ground from gravity, there's no responsibility there. It's just a thing that happens, right? And if it happens to hit somebody in the head, well, what are you going to do? Put the rock in jail? The rock didn't make the decision to fall. And so that puts human beings in the category of that rock, right? And if that's true, no one's responsible for anything. Now, what does that do if you accept that in your own brain? Everything's 100% deterministic. I'm not responsible for anything. You immediately become powerless. Because you're just this leaf floating in the wind. You're like, well, I can't do anything because things are just the way they are. But on the flip side, if you start saying, well, I do have a lot of responsibility. By the way, Nima, do you want to flip back our images so people don't get bored staring at this thing while I'm ranting? If we do have responsibility, suddenly I have the ability to affect change in this universe and say, okay, well, I can imagine a thing and I'm going to go do that thing. Well, if I say, well, everything's deterministic, I've lost the power to do that, right? And if we kind of flip back,
or any reason
to do that. Good point. And then also, if we kind of merge in the topic that we were talking about before, is we brought up Charles Merriam, who's the founder of the behavioralist psychological school, which essentially looks at human beings as automatons, soulless automatons, and again, by soulless, I mean someone who's incapable of free will, that can be guided by stimuli. Like we can control what they're doing through stimuli, right? So what does this do to someone who believes that? Is now that they look at the world and all the people in it, and they say, well, I'm an overlord. All these things are just automatons, so I'm just going to treat them like machines however I want to. They become evil, but if you're deterministic, there's no such thing as evil. Right? So what? Yeah. I guess I'm saying all this because I want to emphasize how important this argument is, and what stems from you personally, how you understand this argument, how your actions in your life change personally from you, and how the actions of your life change personally from everybody else acting, depending on how they fall on the scale of believing this sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, I think it's true to some extent that if the majority of people become successfully manipulated by these stimuli that you just mentioned, that Charles Merriam and behaviorists, but also behavioralists, I guess.
I think behavioralist is the correct.
Yeah. The kind of stuff that they research. You kind of become deterministic. I'm not saying that the universe is deterministic, but a lot of these automatons become so brainwashed, they do start acting like everything is very deterministic.
Okay, I think I do have something to say about that. So I want to preface what I'm about to say by the fact that when we talk about determinism and free will, and I'm speaking specifically of the human, right? Not obviously this thing behind me. This is deterministic. It just does whatever it does. That it's not a binary thing. I think there is a gradient to free will, right? One of the an example of this, if Nima, I had introduced him to Wim Hof, the Iceman. There's this guy who supposedly has figured out this breathing exercise and exposes himself to extreme cold that should kill somebody, and has figured out how to, get people to cure diseases in their body that they shouldn't be able to cure through these breathing and cold training exercises. I've taken some of it, by the way. It's pretty cool stuff. But his claim is that he can get control of the autonomic nervous system through these exercises, right? So in terms of, if I'm saying free will's on a gradient, take someone like this Wim Hof character who's like, well, what you thought was deterministic, this autonomic autonomic bodily systems, they're literally called autonomic because that's a fancy way of saying deterministic, right? The part of the body that you can't control. I can control that now. Right? So he's gone further on the gradient of free will. I think what our Illuminati overlords do is they do things to us to push us in the other direction of that gradient. Once they push us into the other direction of that gradient, through the media, through the dumbing down of the schools, putting fluoride in the water supply, doing that, keeping us fighting each other, maybe the TV emits a certain frequency that puts you in a zombie state, but all that sort of shit, right? Because they do all that sort of stuff, they put you down the levels of your circuitry, we'll call it that, and you do become an automaton, to Nima's point, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe they're right, but they're right because they're intentionally making sure that they poison everybody, we'll say physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, that they lose their souls. In quotes. I'm not saying
that the determinists are right in terms of the big picture, but they can create little subworlds where their vision of a deterministic universe kind of becomes a reality.
Yeah.
I mean, never fully, because individuals still have that spark in them that can be, that can light a fire that makes them question their existence again, Westworld style. But I mean, Westworld. I don't know if you've seen Westworld in HBO. Great example where this corporation creates a little subworld with literal automatons, and some of them begin waking up to that reality. That there's a world outside of the fake world. Uh-huh. Let's continue reading.
Okay. And then, if you don't mind, leave it on our screen because I think it's more entertaining to watch us read than it is to have the.
If people are watching this, I think it's helpful for them to see. The words, because it's pretty deep stuff. It's not casual conversation. But when we discuss it, I can switch back.
Okay, fine.
If you enjoy our faces so much.
I enjoy our faces. Nima's so pretty, I want to see it.
Okay. Because the one regulates and orders his creation, nature is uniform and causality exists. Since the same causes bring about the same effects, induction is possible, and universal propositions can be formulated. And since universal propositions are a precondition to logical deduction, logical deductions can be made. Because the one, so understand, it gives an account for logic, empiricism, reality, metaphysics, epistemology.
Well, and then, and again, to turn this into non-philosophy babble, right? He's basically saying that the fact that we have universals, and again, for the uninitiated here, a universal is, for me, saying, like, I'm sitting at a table, right? Well, table is a universal. If I say table, that applies to everything that's a table, as opposed to me going, well, here's this thing, and then I actually have two tables here, and here's this other thing, but I have nothing to connect them with because I have no way to identify something called a universal, which is a table. Right.
Exactly.
He's saying that the fact that we even have the ability to universalize stuff is an extension of God in the first place.
The divine mind, yeah. Because the one first conceived the patterns or kinds after which all particular instantiations are created, universals have a referent and are real. Consequently, the classification and categorizing of man's experience is meaningful. Language and thought are therefore possible. Because the one's character constitutes an absolute criteria which is obligatory on all creatures, and for which there are absolute consequences, morality has a referent.
I think that's also very interesting. I think it's also super duper interesting. I think the one person, at least that I'm aware of, who has done the best at attempting to refute that is Stefan Molyneux, which is to say, we can come to moral understanding from man, not necessarily from God. But even that, ultimately, you could say, okay, within the realm of man creating his own morality, if there's no such thing as God, and we just poof into oblivion after we're dead, I personally am unable to understand an idea where the morality is relevant. Okay, you can create a morality, but who cares? Right? Okay, so it's bad to steal based on these universal principles, but I still benefit from it. So why do I care? And if there's no punishment or reward, to put it bluntly, at the end of the day for it, what's to stop me from doing it?
Yeah.
Right? And you can say, well, you'll create enemies or whatever, and eventually it'll come back to bite you. It doesn't come back to bite everybody. Right? I mean, let's think of a couple of examples of rulers that end up conquering everything, and they live to the end of their days going, I'm God of the world, right?
Can we get Genghis Khan on this conversation?
Right.
So, what you're talking about is universally preferable behavior by Stefan Molyneux, and that I agree with you. It's a great attempt at a rational proof for secular ethics that doesn't require God, but it's going to end up running into the dead end that we will get into, because UPB is basically based on empiricism and maybe rationalism, but in a casual manner. He's not necessarily rigorous with the philosophy, because at the end of the day, he can't account for the validity of empiricism and logic. So it becomes an arbitrary choice to say, well, moral rules are universal and they have to be logical. Well, why? Because you said so. Some people disagree with you on that. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, in what's, of course, otherwise a very impressive effort, I think.
I don't want to sit here and criticize Stefan Molyneux.
Right. No.
Great job.
But I honestly think that I was just thinking about this the other day. Actually, if you have a theistic worldview, UPB makes even more sense, because now you can account for why morality is logical.
Yeah.
Now you can account for why universals exist.
I agree.
So, all right, let's continue here. Because morality has a reference. You will recognize this as the revelation and cosmology of the three great monotheistic religions. But we are not here concerned with whether or not one of these is true, the true heir of that revelation. For that question is an in-house inquiry, which becomes relevant only after we have established the preconditional necessity of that revelation.
So we're not going to argue, is Judaism, Christianity, or Islam
right?
The correct inheritor of what we're about to talk about here.
Yeah, that's a debate that would probably be more than 14 pages of a paper. But this story is not generally accepted today. It is rejected as a wild guess and a vain imagining. Knowledge cannot be gotten from God, whether he exists or not. Man himself must be the determiner of truth. Man is the measure of all things, as Protagoras said. Even if the above story is true, every part of it must be certified by passing the canons of man's autonomous epistemology.
Interruption here. I do want to say this. I don't have an answer to this, but this has historically frustrated me a little bit. So to say, okay, we go through the argument and we reject the idea of atheism. And we say, okay, therefore we conclude that God exists. Therefore, this religion is true. Still kind of a jump for me.
Right, and that's not the jump. Right. That's not the jump we're going to be making.
Right.
Because the latter is to a large extent a historical investigation. Right? We do historical investigations on all kinds of other issues, on politics, political history, and all those, statecraft. So that applies to theism as well. Which religion has the best documented historical evidence and the longest chain of non-contradictory revelation. That
Right.
would have to be the next step after solving this question that we're working on right now.
And I would even add an asterisk to this. Is there one that has actually accurately described it? Right?
Right,
Even if
that is-
there's one that has done it the best, does that mean it has correctly described everything?
Good
Right?
question.
Yeah, we're not answering that today. We're just
Right.
throwing it out there.
And so we must turn to the antithesis of this story. We must turn to the story of autonomous epistemology. The story starts, as do most philosophy texts, not with Adam, Abraham, or Moses, but with Thales. So basically, I think
We start with the Greeks, is what he's saying.
yes, and of course, this previous paragraph, he's not made the case for God yet. He's presented the theistic story, and he's saying it's either this or it's the autonomous epistemology. But if the autonomous epistemology doesn't work, then we're back to this story, unless you can come up with a better one, right? So, autonomous epistemology. The story of autonomous epistemology begins on May 28, 585 BC at 6:13 in the evening. At least this is when Dr. Gordon Clark humorously suggests that philosophy began. It was then that the man who is generally recognized as the first philosopher, Thales, made the first prediction of a solar eclipse. Though men had recorded the movements of heavenly bodies for eons, Thales was the first to see in these movements a pattern, a common denominator by which all heavenly bodies moved. He was the first to find a general law. He found unity in diversity. He reduced the many to one.
And I think, interruption here, I think this is a very interesting idea because it shows what we take for granted. Like, of course, the heavenly bodies move in a rational thing that are to be calculated with an ellipse and a Kepler's law and all that sort of stuff. That was not an assumption that was made, what was it, 2,600 years ago. Right? That no one from heaven had come down and told them that yet. They had to sit here and figure this out. And this is, I mean, imagine being in a time and a place where there's no modernization of anything. You don't even have a fucking chalkboard. You got to like draw in the sand to do your mathematical calculations. You have the mathematical calculations. You draw them in the sand, and you're able to predict a solar eclipse. I couldn't do that if you sat down with all my stuff myself and said, okay, without looking it the fuck up, use some instruments to figure out how, when the next solar eclipse is. I couldn't do it.
Right.
And I'm a math guy. Like, I wouldn't know where to start. The fact that this guy sat down by himself without anybody telling him, like, okay, here's how you do it, and here's the calculator, and here's the fucking, reference book, and all that. He figured it out. That's really impressive. That's really fucking impressive. And I could see where, if philosophy starts and he does this and everybody goes, wait a minute. We can predict stuff? That's pretty big in the human understanding. I just wanted to sit in awe of his
Yeah.
discovery there.
Which is also why the priesthood was the instrument of expansion in
Sumerian society, civilization.
Sumerian society.
Yeah.
Right. In during the age of the agrarian empire / the axial age, I guess. In this
Yeah.
one.
This is the beginnings of the axial age.
So honestly, I mean, I don't even know if it's true that Thales was the first one to do this, right? Because Sumerians were way before.
Remember, all this stuff is just like us putting together the history from like scraps of tablets that we were able to find. Like, obviously, there was a whole hell of a lot more going on than whatever we have record of. But this is the earliest record we have of something like this happening. So whoever did it first, what I just said, whether or not it was Thales or not, put the awe that I just generated on that person.
But there are more things to unify in the universe than the motion of heavenly bodies. Thales proposed that the one element that makes up and unites every object in the universe is water. Water is the primordial stuff of which all reality is made. Now, what's important here is not Thales' answer, but the question he raised. What ultimately is everything? This started a great debate. Anaximenes said that ultimate reality is air. Heraclitus said, on the other hand, ultimate reality is fire. Parmenides said that they were both wrong. It is being. This debate over the nature of ultimate reality was the beginning of metaphysics, and arguments over metaphysics led to arguments about arguments, and the debate over what constituted a good argument was the beginning of epistemology. What was needed was a story of knowledge by which one could know that a given proposition was true. Now, the pre-Socratics have exemplified a few epistemological propensities that have continued throughout history.
And these guys are pre-Socratics, that were the guys who came before Socrates are the ones that we're just describing right now. Yeah.
Correct. Some, such as Parmenides, felt that the best arguments are obtained through reason. For example, if all men are mortal and if Socrates is a man, then one man can reason that Socrates is mortal, and necessarily so. The appeal to these thinkers is certainty. If reason clearly dictates something and experience suggests something else, then there's a problem with experience. Reason is believing.
Okay, and stop, because I really want to emphasize this and what's coming up in the next paragraph, is that we're going to split into two different worlds which never stop being argued about. And this first one, I think in like the German philosophical sense, turns into the term rationalism, right? Which is to basically say what goes on in my head is superior than what goes on out in reality. And then the other side goes, no, what goes out in reality is superior to whatever goes on in my head. And ultimately, there's a mix, right? But I mean, this is the start of that conversation. So Nima, go ahead.
Yeah. On the other hand, some, such as Democritus, felt that the arguments are obtained through experience. Seeing is believing. So here we have the
empiricist and the rationalist views.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The appeal to these thinkers is the concreteness of their experience. If reason indicates something other than the dictates of observation, then you know something is wrong with your reasoning. In time, these propensities and this debate resolved itself into two primary rival theories of knowledge that are still with us today: rationalism and empiricism.
Like we just said.
Rationalism was developed by Plato and hit its high watermark with the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes. Empiricism was developed by Plato's student Aristotle and reached its modern expression in John Locke. Okay, let's start with rationalism. The rationalist takes his model of truth from mathematics. The certainty of its axioms and conclusions appealed to him. Reason is primary and regulates his interpretation of experience. For the rationalist, at least some ideas such as the universality of logic and the fact that the sum of the angles in a triangle is exactly 180 degrees have never been experienced and must be gotten independently of and prior to experience. These ideas are known a priori. They are said to be innate and self-evidently true. Descartes says that they are clear and distinct.
Okay, pause. Let's turn this into something a little more graspable. Because I think this is so important, particularly what he said about the triangle, right? Because mathematically, we all learned it in geometry class in middle school or whatever, that a triangle by definition has 180 degrees, right? If you add up all corners, and this is perfectly true by definition, right? Within the realm of mathematics, this is true by definition, and you come into the weird thing when you hit reality is you never actually find an example of that anywhere in reality. It doesn't exist, right? There's no such thing as a perfect triangle. There's no such thing as a perfect circle, that sort of thing. The rationalists address this by saying, okay, therefore, if the perfection doesn't exist in reality, and the perfection exists in my mind, what goes on in my mind is therefore superior. That's what they draw from that, right? I just want to emphasize that point, and then Nima, go on to the empiricists.
Unfortunately, these truths weren't self-evident to the empiricists. They were quick to point out that not even the rationalists agree on what is clear and distinct. Plato, Descartes, and Teilhard de Chardin all conceived very different rationalist systems. Aristotle and Locke both expressed concern that such unjustified starting points would color one's observations and destroy objectivity. They felt that if one allows himself to begin with some absolute starting point that is justified only by his own internal criterion and sense of rational necessity, then he's made himself the absolute determiner of truth and has abandoned any hope of objectivity.
Which I completely agree.
Yeah,
I 100% agree with that. Basically,
you can spin all kinds of...
You can make up anything in your head. You become God to yourself, and you can just make up and apply, apply that to. I mean, it's basically you're insane if you do that. Right? Whatever I'm imagining in my head is what's going on in reality, right? That's like you're fucking insane if that's actually what's going on in your head.
Yeah. For example, Euclidean geometry has been the paradigm case of a priori formal systems for over 2 millennia. Its axioms are self-evident, clear and distinct. Let's take Euclid's axiom of parallels. Given a straight line and a point not on that line, one and only one line can be drawn through that point parallel to the given line. This axiom appears to most people to be self-evident and true beyond a rational doubt. With this and Euclid's other axioms, a fully coherent system can be produced. The assumption behind rationalism is that if a proposition is self-evident, then it describes the world in which we live. Therefore, it has been believed for the last few millennium that Euclid's geometry describes the world in which we live.
The last few millennia. Sorry, that bugged me.
Yeah.
I do want to.
I don't know why he does this, but he always just says millennium. So I don't know if that's another way of.
He failed
saying...
his Latin class. Yeah. I do want to give some credence to Euclid here. Apparently, Euclid wasn't sold on his fifth axiom. He had 4 other axioms on his fifth one, which is this thing about, if you've got 2 parallel lines that they'll never ever touch each other, he himself was like, I'm not sure about this one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive. But there are reasons for thinking that the self-evidentness has more to do with the structure of our language and our assumptions about reality than with reality itself. Right? In other words, we create a system where this becomes true by definition.
Well, and
currently,
let's unpack that previous thing, the paragraph, because you and I were been talking about this, and we're just nodding our heads because we're seeing it again. But I think it needs to be unpacked. Is that so? Because I can imagine some people are going, well, yeah, of course, if you've got 2 parallel lines, they're never going to touch, duh. If that's the point of this, is to say, okay, we've created these rational ideas of mathematics that are so clear they appear to be self-evident, and the question that arises is, if they are self-evident like that, does that mean they are true? And it's easy, particularly for whatever reason, for mathematics. Like, for example, the triangle has 180 degrees. Of course, I'm looking at it. It's right there. What else could it be? Because this stuff is so self-evident, it's so easy to accept as truth. And this paper is questioning this, saying, okay, because we made it up in our mind and it's true in our mind, does that mean is it true in reality?
Right. Just to give one concrete example, if we have 2 lines that... So if the universe, so we have to assume infinity, right? We have to assume that the universe is infinitely large. It goes on forever. In that case, Euclid's axiom would be true. But what if it's not the case? What if there's an ending somewhere? The lines might never meet within the realm of the existing universe. If we're just assuming infinity, a concept that we absolutely cannot grasp, a concept that is absolutely fantastical to us, and we claim that, so this is all self-evident because it's based on...
And this is a perfect example of even what we do today of taking something in our head and applying it to reality and say, okay, well, therefore, what is in my head is in reality. And it's what's the word I want? Egotistical. It's a little egotistical for us to do that, right? And I mean, not that I'm like... I fall in this category too, right? I mean, you see something like that. Well, it's obvious. It's obvious. It's just the way it is. But then when you probe, you're like, well, maybe it isn't that obvious, which is what we're doing right now.
Right. By the way, can we check if we're getting any chats on Restream or whatever? But anyway,
I'll do that. Nope.
Okay. But there are reasons for thinking that the self-evidentness has more to do with the structure of our language and our assumptions about reality than with reality itself. Currently, there seems to be a consensus in cosmology that the universe is finite and unbounded.
I'm not sure what that means. I thought unbounded means infinite. Did he make a typo here?
Right. No, I'm not sure either what
Yeah.
it means. It's not the point. But this means our universe is non-Euclidean. Thus, there can be no infinite straight lines in our universe, and Euclid's fifth axiom is false. In fact, fully coherent non-Euclidean geometries have been developed that reject this axiom. Consequently, if we accept the current cosmological model, we have here a proposition that is both self-evident and false. If Euclid's axiom of parallels is necessary, then the current state of cosmology is false. But if the current state of cosmology is even possible, then the traditional understanding of self-evidence is false.
So I want to hammer this point a little bit more. You want to switch the videos back. So when I was in college, I was a math guy, chemistry major, which all chemistry guys have to be math guys. And occasionally I would poke around in the college library and look at math books, because that's what I did. And I found this one that was talking about integrals equaling more than the shape would suggest. What the hell do I mean by that? For example, this is, I believe it's called the coastline paradox, where you say, okay, let's take Great Britain, for example, or I mean, that includes Northern Ireland, just the island of Britain, right? Is how long is the coastline? And we could go on Wikipedia and go, oh, well, it's, such and such hundreds of thousands of kilometers, or not hundreds of thousands, but such thousands of kilometers, whatever. There it is. Wikipedia said so. Bam. Well, when you look at how did you come up with that number, how did you measure that? The weird thing is that the coastline starts to approach infinity if you look at it the right way. Well, what does that mean, right? So again, if we take in the rational world of mathematics, we look at a circle and we say, okay, well, that's the circumference, or let's say the area. The area of that circle is pi r squared, right? Because when we do the derivation or whatever, that comes out with, that's exactly what it is. Well, if you start looking at it in terms of calculus, which is to say, okay, how do you start measuring? Basically, calculus is, to put this stupidly, is you're measuring with a smaller and smaller ruler, and you let that ruler get down to the size of 0 in order to perfectly fit everything that you're doing. Well, if you look at reality, if you look at like a rock, and you're going around this rock, as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, you start noticing more and more little indentations. More and more little indentations. So if you took that rock and you drew a circle around it, and you say, okay, well, pi r squared, that's rock's a circle, and pi r squared, okay, there it is. But you zoom in a little more, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, there's some little bumps here. Okay, but I got these bumps, so that adds a little bit. And you zoom in a little bit more, and okay, there's some more bumps here, and that adds a little bit. And you keep zooming in, and you keep finding more and more bumps, and that actually increases the area or the circumference or whatever. And this is the coastline paradox, which is to say, okay, did you measure Britain with a yardstick? Did you measure it by centimeter? Did you measure it by millimeter? Did you measure it by mile? Did you, depending on how big your stick is of how you're moving around these rocks or moving around the shoreline, it's actually changing what the answer is. And when this book was pointing out where it's like, okay, if you take the integral of a circle and you say, okay, it's pi r squared, when you look at actual stuff, it actually ends up being pi r squared or 8% bigger than pi r squared, or something like that, right? When you look at what's actually happening in reality, or you attempt to look at it, right?
Well,
and
it's an example of our methods of measurement impacting our ability to arrive at the truth, right?
Well, and then it's a perfect example of what this guy's talking about, which is to say, okay, is the thing that we're coming up in our head the reality? Even if it appears to be self-evident, is that the reality? Or is there something else going on that we haven't figured out yet? And even in the perfect world of mathematics, which the original rationalists, like Pythagoras, turned into religion, essentially, that they end up going crazy because the reality doesn't form to their mathematics.
Correct.
Point made. Please continue.
Boom. Mic drop. Okay. Now, there is no problem with revising empirical a posteriori postulates.
I hate those terms, by the way, a priori and a posteriori, but
a priori self-evident truths are supposed to be absolute and invariant. This and other such problems have prompted some philosophers to suggest that these self-evident notions simply express the limits of our perceptions and conceptual models. Our limited experience of space until recently was very Euclidean. This in turn defined the language by which we express these experiences and think. Propositions that appear self-evidently certain may do so because the rules of our language won't allow us to think otherwise. And now we come to empiricism.
I think that's just is more emphasizing what we already.
Yeah. In contrast, empiricists propose that all knowledge must be founded not on a priori assumptions, but on experience, a posteriori. All ideas represent some object in the world and must be traceable back to some concrete experience. Truth may not be certain, but it is concrete and objective. If you don't agree with someone's observation, you can see for yourself. But as we said before, the empiricists had their problems too. First, they had the obvious ones. On the one hand, the empiricist cannot see universal propositions and perfect triangles. On the other hand, he does see mirages and sticks that appear to bend when stuck in the water. Yet in both these cases, they make judgments contrary to these experiences. Furthermore, empiricists have never successfully accounted for how they could have any experience without first bringing concepts such as causality, space, time, quantity, etc. into to the experience.
So to boil that down, he's essentially saying that, okay, empiricists really rely on, okay, what you could see, because, here's something that's self-evident. If I make a prediction and I go check it, and my prediction doesn't accurately describe what I'm seeing, well, then my prediction's wrong, and I got to go back to the drawing board. That's true. but the empiricists turn around, and the philosophy that they argue is essentially predictions cannot be made. Right? You can only work with what you got, and what he's saying here is that, okay, sure, but you're coming to that table of discussion having already brought some rationalistic ideas such as time, causality, and space. Right? There's some assumptions, rationalistic assumptions that you're bringing to the table to even have that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Even beyond rationalism, actually. Causality. That's not rational, right? Causality is something.
It's a faith. It's something that you take in faith. Yes.
Right. Yeah. The empiricist assumes that when one billiard ball hits the other one, that the second ball's motion was caused by the first one. But all that the empiricist sees are one ball moving, then another ball moving, and
this is a David Hume argument, right? Yeah.
Right. He assumes a concept that he hasn't proven yet. So what was all this talk about? Oh no, we're going to prove everything from the very bottom up, based on experience. Well, no, you just assumed causality. You assumed time, by the way, too. You assumed that something happened first, and then after that. That's sort of what he's referring to here. But bigger problems start to develop when you take. Right. But bigger problems start to develop when you take empiricism seriously. George Berkeley acknowledged Locke's realization that though our ideas come from our perceptions, the only objects of our minds are those ideas. Our minds never make direct contact with the external material world. Consequently, we can never set our ideas over against the material world and corroborate the integrity of those ideas. In fact, Berkeley observed that since the mind never makes contact with the material world, there is no empirical reason to think that it is the source of our perceptions. In fact, there is no reason to think that the material world exists at all. So what's he talking about? Well, how do you know you're not...
You're not in the Matrix.
In the Matrix tank, yeah. How do you know you're not just an idea in some superior mind? How do you know that objects around you exist and all this stuff? Let's assume we see a desk in front of us.
Hold on, I want to do a quick interruption here. I want to bring in some occult stuff here. The Kabbalah has an interesting, I should say the Tree of Life. If you look at the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, right, and you look at all these Sephiroth that are on it, Da'at, the one that is associated with the throat, if you put the human map over the Kabbalistic tree of life, is supposedly this connection where you say, okay, because you have the lesser spheres and then you have the upper spheres, and the lesser spheres are reality and the upper spheres are this thing that doesn't exist but still exists for us to talk about, sort of world. And in between, there's this spot that isn't in itself a sphere. Yeah, it's all written in Hebrew there, but it's the no, it's not. It's in English. Da'at. So that one isn't actually a sphere. It's like this non-existent point of inflection where the pre-existence turns into existence. And if you map this in a different way, okay, so you've got the reality out there, you've got the mind in here. What happens in between? What is that thing that happens in between? Now, of course, this Kabbalistic thing is not trying to describe this in any sort of scientific manner, right? But the Kabbalistic thing is at least addressing, whether it's crazy or not, it's addressing that something happens in between those two spaces, right? There's something. What's the term I want? Can I say mystical? Can I say divine? Can I say I don't know what word that happens there, but there's something that is very, very, let's say, indescribable, at least till now, that happens there that connects what's going on out here to what's going on up here, and it's real and it's important to know that it's there. And I think I would argue that whether you're the rationalist or the empiricist, you're denying that mechanism happening. You're saying, okay, it's either all out there or it's all up here, and there's no connection. Comment made. Please continue.
Yep. Okay, let's assume we see a desk in front of us. What we're tempted to say is, I have a perception of a desk in front of me. Therefore, there's a desk in front of me. The first assertion, I have a perception of a desk in front of me, is empirical and not controversial. But the second assertion, there is a desk in front of me, doesn't follow from the first. It has no logical connection. It is not empirical. It is a bold metaphysical assertion. The idea of material substances was completely unnecessary and unjustified was a completely necessary and was a completely unnecessary and unjustified metaphysical entity that Berkeley dispensed of with a flick of Occam's razor.
Yeah, so it's basically there's, in terms of the way we describe things, it doesn't, it's an unnecessary level of complication, so just get rid of it.
Exactly. This kind of rigorous empiricism would know no bounds in the hands of David Hume. Hume revived Leibniz's analytic synthetic distinction.
And we're getting into the German crap. Okay, I'll do my best.
And decided he would allow as rational only those beliefs that are either analytically true or empirically verifiable. Thus, all ideas are either analytic, synthetic, or nonsense. However, Hume's analytic truths, though known a priori, should not be taken as a concession to the rationalists. Hume's analytic truths are mere tautologies. For example, take the phrase, all sisters are women. Propositions like this may tell us something about how we use language, but they give us no new information about the world. They are trivial. Hume took Berkeley's rigorous empiricism a step further and demonstrated that just as there is no empirical basis for the belief in an external material world as the cause of our perceptions, there is no empirical basis for belief in an internal mental world either. He pointed out that since our experience is limited to our perceptions, there's nothing in our experience to indicate that the origin of our perceptions is in either a material substance or a mental.
This guy must have been so stoned, David Hume. What was he on?
Yeah.
Man. Okay.
Well, I mean, he was also he was an aristocrat who had a lot of time. He would muse about whether the porter behind him actually existed.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, Therefore, any substantive affirmation beyond perception is empirically unjustified. The external world, whether mental or material, is empirically undemonstrable and analytically unnecessary. It is a mere metaphysical speculation. As a matter of habit, we may continue to believe in it, but it is nothing more than an unjustified dogma. He destroys here all naturalistic justification for belief in an external world. He then turns his empirical gun on the internal world. He points out that our notion of ourselves as a substance that continues to receive perceptions is yet another unsubstantiated postulation. Among our perceptions, we never perceive the self as the perceiver of our perceptions. He destroys here all autonomous rational justification for the notion of the self as an entity independent of a collection of perceptions.
Pause. So I think this is worth pointing out. The author of this paper is not arguing this. He's saying that this is what David Hume is arguing, right? And
right.
that this is interesting because if David Hume is taking empiricism to its logical end, what we're finding is he's destroying both the external world and the internal world. If you take this seriously, this is where this ends up, and the guy writing the paper is showing the David Hume, who took this to its extreme. This is what he came up with. There's no reality out there. There's no reality in here. So it's nothing. I guess there's nothing going on at all.
Right. I think it may appear a little nitpicky or ridiculous to like a lay philosophy listener or watcher. But it's going to become more practical and relevant also as we get to the end. What he's doing here is
showing you what happens when you say, okay, I'm an empiricist. Okay, well, let's take it to its logical conclusion, like David Hume did. Here's the result. There's no reality on either side of the fence. Yeah.
Right. Our concepts of an external material world and of an internal mental or spiritual world are neither analytic nor are they perceived. Therefore, they are, on the canons of empiricism, nonsense. But what other concepts are neither analytically true nor perceived? Hume examined the philosophical concept of identity. Identity is the concept that there's some continuity in the nature of an object over time. In other words, is the person reading this paragraph the same entity that read the last paragraph?
No, we swapped Nima out when you weren't looking.
Yeah. Hume observed that all we perceive, strictly speaking, is a series of sensations, but we have no sensation that corresponds to the idea that a given object in one sensation is the same object in another sensation. We have no sensation of identity. This concept is supplied by the perceiver, yet it is not analytically necessary, nor is it perceived. You may recognize this as the same point made by Heraclitus when he said, "You can never step into the same river twice."
Yeah. I think that was clear.
So identity is, once again, it's something that we are assuming, right? I see this microphone. I saw it 5 minutes ago, and I see it now.
Must be the same microphone.
Yeah, so I guess it's the same microphone, right? But why? On what basis do I make that assertion? I have no real basis for it. It's an assumption because of, my empirical observation of it. But I'm using. I think Ayn Rand actually calls this the fallacy of the stolen concept. I'm using a concept that I haven't proven yet. I'm using a concept of identity to make all kinds of empirical claims, but I haven't proven identity. And by the way, also, I think our bodies regenerate completely every 7 years or so.
Yep. So every 7 years, we're a completely new human anyway.
Right.
So
why am I still
I don't owe you that debt that I owe you from 7 years ago because I'm a new person. It's not the same person. Yeah.
What Hume is most famous for, however, is a critique that fundamentally upset the foundations of both science and common sense, his critique of causality. He noted that when he looked at two events, say one billiard ball striking another, that he could perceive one ball moving prior to the movement of the other ball. He could perceive the one ball touching...
Yeah, this is what you described earlier. Exactly.
The other ball, yeah. He could perceive one ball moving after being touched by the other ball, but he could not perceive a necessary connection between the two balls. He could never see the cause between the two events. Causality, like identity and external and internal substance, are properties of our minds, not of the world. They are products of our imagination. The reason we believe in the external world, the self and identity, is not for logical or empirical reasons, for there are none. It is psychological. It is a habit of the mind. But not even Hume went far enough. First, we must ask if Hume's analytic synthetic criteria for truth are known analytically or synthetically. It is not true by definition, and it is certainly not a perception. Therefore, on Hume's own criterion, it is nonsense. This is a problem that will later plague the logical positivists.
Now, I always get confused when they start talking, again, all this German analytic synthetic, I just get totally lost. But I understand the point that he's making here is that when you take these, again, these rationalist, these empiricist ideas to their logical conclusion, they become self-contradictory.
Well, I mean, and the analytic synthetic criteria is not something we observe empirically. So how do you use that for your from the ground up empiricism? You're assuming something that you haven't, that empirical sensation hasn't presented to you. Secondly, if there's no identity between one event and another, each and every perception is new and distinct. Hume should not have been able to say there is a similarity or likeness between any two perceptions at all. Similarity is not perceived, and to suggest a similarity between perceptions at any level is to make an identity, something that Hume already demonstrated could not be done empirically. So in other words...
Same thing we just said. It's becoming self-contradictory.
Right, so we have like a stream of sensations, right? I turn my head here, I turn my head there. I get different visual stimuli into my brain. At the same time, I can perceive that there is similarity between these two sensations. But what's similarity?
Right.
How do I observe
Something
similarity?
just popped into my head. I don't think we'll be able to find it.
Similarity is a mental concept. Again, that's just...
Can you turn our screens back on? I have a comic I want to describe because I don't think I'll be able to find it fast enough. So I read SMBC Comics, which is a Saturday morning breakfast cereal comics or something like that. And he's got this old comic where it's kind of this top overview of a circle that represents a person, and it shows his field of view. He draws out this like V shape for the field of view, and he's looking at a room or something from over the top. And everywhere outside of his view, he has all these faces with Hitler mustaches, and it says group of densely packed Hitlers. So in his field of view, he sees whatever he's seeing, and right outside that field of view is nothing but densely packed Hitlers. And at the bottom it says, technically, you can't prove that this is not true.
Right.
Right? This is exactly what we're talking about, right? It's like, okay, here's my field of view. Technically, you can't prove right now that outside of that field of view is not densely packed Hitlers.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's a comic making fun of exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's a good point. Similarity is not perceived, and to suggest a similarity between perceptions at any level is to make an identity, something Hume already demonstrated could not be done empirically. Consequently, Hume should not have been able to speak of a prior billiard ball events and latter billiard ball events, for to do so is to make an identity between the two event perceptions. In fact, Hume shouldn't have identified a single event as a billiard ball, for to do so is to identify that perception as a member of the category balls.
Right. So basically, he's saying the empiricist has no realm to talk about universals at all.
Exactly. But there can be no categories if there's no similarity between perceptions, and if there's because, like I just said, similarity is a concept that's given to me. It's not something I prove empirically from the ground up just
right.
by observing stuff. There can be no categories if there's no similarity between perceptions. And so then, because categories are things that are similar, right? A table is a flat surface with a certain number of legs, but it's instantiated in different ways. But how do I know that they're similar? What's similarity? Again, there are no categories if there's no similarity between perceptions. And if there are no categories, no given perception can be identified as an instance of a category. But if no given perception can be identified as an instance of category, then perceptions cannot be identified at all. If perceptions cannot be identified, then they cannot be spoken of and nothing can be known. In fact, propositions cannot even be identified as analytic or synthetic.
Yeah, so he's beaten. I don't know if he's beating the horse to death, but he's hitting it
Yeah.
multiple angles here.
As Dr. Bounson points out, a rigorous commitment to admitting only propositions that are certified by either reason or direct perception is not only inadequate as an epistemology, it is completely destructive to the entire enterprise. But having rejected revelatory theism, what alternative does the autonomous philosopher have?
Okay, wait. That was a powerful point. Scroll back up.
Yeah.
So, that was pretty direct. So basically he's saying, if there is no revelation from God, how else could you come to any other conclusion? Right? If you have nothing, if you've brought nothing to the table to work with, and you have to work from the ground up, there's no other way to come to any other conclusion.
If there are no concepts given
Yeah.
that you admit, then I guess once again in Ayn Rand's terminology, ironically she's an atheist, philosophy of the stolen concept.
I think you had that right. Stolen idea, stolen concept, whatever.
No, what are the fallacy? The fallacy of the stolen concept. Sorry. Yeah. I'm just wondering, is there anything else that we can comment on here? No,
because I think he's about to get into it. Because I think he's made the argument on one side. Oh no, he keeps going. Oh, I saw the word Emmanuel.
Oh, it gets more and more ridiculous. Yeah. So I mean, the empiricist, autonomous thing it goes on, right? That's why. So some have suggested that after Hume, philosophy should have been over. David Hume didn't just attack particular problems associated with particular theories of knowledge. He attacked the very foundational dogmas that undergird all autonomous theories of knowledge. He demonstrated just how cut off the knower is from the objects of knowledge and from himself. For a theory of knowledge to proceed, man will have to already know a priori what the world is, what he is, and how the two are and could be related. But this is a principled problem and cannot be solved by mere creativity and ingenuity. Some future philosophers will ignore these critical problems and continue to offer naive descriptions of the world they believe to be true, and others will simply abandon truth as the objective of epistemology and propose other programs. We will look now at an example of a philosopher who, upon realizing our natural limitations, begins to redefine the job description of epistemologists. Hume shook the foundations of epistemology so strongly that he awakened a professor in Königsberg, Prussia, by the name of Immanuel Kant. Kant saw that by demonstrating that certain concepts such as causality, substance, identity, etc. were indeterminable as realities in the world, Hume had destroyed epistemology. He then announced that he could save epistemology by shifting the location of these realities from the world to the mind. He said they are the categories of thought. They are the way we must think about the world. Because the categories of thought exist in the mind prior to experience, they are a priori. Because they refer to reality, they are synthetic. Hence, they are called synthetic a prioris. Our experience of the world is a compound of sense data and these categories of thought. They are the way we perceive the world, what he called phenomena, whether it is the way the world, what he called noumena, is or not. Hence, Kant points out, we cannot know the noumenal world itself. We can only know the world as the mind presents it to us.
Okay, I'm already falling asleep listening to this Kantian stuff. So
Yeah,
I think we need to try really hard to pull this into some sort of non-philosophical babble. And when it comes to Kant, I fail miserably at it.
Well, I mean, what Kant is saying, like, Hume has demonstrated that we cannot prove the existence of an external world, so let's just get rid of the external world altogether. All we know in our heads are the phenomena we experience, and that's all we can discuss, really. And then I guess his point here is that did Kant really save epistemology?
Well,
I mean, I guess it's
okay. Well, let's talk about how Kant supposedly contradicted him, right? So Kant said there's this thing called a synthetic, and I'm presuming a synthetic is okay. You've connected your thought to the external world, and so synthetically you've been able to connect it. Do I have that? Do you think I have that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, he
Sorry,
says-
open it back up because I need to keep reading it because I'm not entirely sure what I read. So this is the Kantian refutement of Hume, essentially, is that because the categories of thought exist in the mind prior to the experience, they're a priori. Okay, I think that's the definition of a priori. Because they refer to reality, they are synthetic. Hence, they are synthetic a priorities. Our experience of the world is compound of sense data of these categories and thought. But I don't see how this refutes Hume, because Hume's saying, well, there is no reality to connect to. So
no, Hume said there is a reality, and I can only learn about the reality through empirical observation.
Huh. Okay. And so they are the way that
At least in the beginning, and then this paper he takes Hume's approach to
its
the
conclusion.
To its ridiculous conclusion.
So we start with something in the head, and then we apply it to reality through our sense perceptions, and we mix it. This is the synthetic. And
so there's
the way
some,
the way we perceive the world as phenomena, and the way of the world is noumena.
Yes.
So Kant points out we can't actually know what the world actually is. You got a telegram thing popping up there. We can't know the way the world actually is. We can only know our perceptions of it. Isn't this the same damn thing Hume was saying? We can only know the world as the mind presents it. Okay. I feel like this is the same argument. Let's keep reading.
Yeah.
I hate Kant. Well, despise motherfucker.
I think he kind of makes the point. Did Kant actually save epistemology? Well, his synthetic a prioris, by his own admission, describe no properties in the noumenal world.
What I was just saying. Okay.
Yeah, they are the mind's contribution to the phenomenal world. So what exactly does it mean to say they're synthetic? Prior to Kant, the task of epistemology was to justify our synthetic judgments, but these were judgments regarding the noumenal world. Hume demonstrated that this could not be done. Kant proved that his synthetic a prioris are necessary to experience, but he does not mean by synthetic what Hume and others meant by synthetic. He has not proven what Hume said could not be proven. He has not answered Hume at all. Kant has changed the subject.
Okay, I feel better. This is exactly what I just said.
Kant did not tell us about the world. He told us about our minds and about how we think, and called it synthetic. Furthermore, Hume already told us that the mind habitually thinks of the world in terms of causality, substance, identity, etc. And since these are descriptions of our psychology and not of the world cannot be known and science is not possible. Kant's categories of thoughts, however, are also a description of the way the mind thinks of the world and not descriptions of the world itself. Yet Kant thinks he saved epistemology.
Side note, I think this is where I quit reading last night.
Okay.
I think as soon as I saw the word Kant, I'm like, I'm too tired. I'm going to bed.
Well, I think we're done. We're basically done with
Yeah.
Kant, because now we're getting into foundationalism. Those who followed Kant's lead gave up trying to describe the world as it actually is, because they realized that all traditional rational and empirical epistemologies and conceptions of science have a similar underlying structure. They are all foundationalistic. They realized that all beliefs could be divided into two categories: beliefs that are justified by referring to other beliefs, and beliefs that are not subject to justification but are the foundation for all other beliefs. The challenge here, of course, are these foundational beliefs. Rationalists thought their innate self-evident a priori beliefs were the best candidates, and empiricists thought their sense impressions were the best candidates. But this discussion has never advanced beyond Hume. We should, in fact, recognize that this is a problem beyond resolution if the object of knowledge is to be the world.
So this is really interesting. So he's pointing out, if you walk down the road of rationalism, you run into problems. And if you walk down the road of empiricism, you run into problems. So what do we do?
Yeah, so then the answer was foundationalism. And I guess that's where we're going to get into Descartes. Aristotle had already pointed out long ago that our options regarding first truths, that is foundations, are limited. asked to justify why we ultimately believe something, we will either give an answer or we will not. If we do not give an answer, our belief is arbitrary and fideistic.
That's a word I'm familiar with. Fideistic.
If we give an answer, then our answer will make reference to some other belief or beliefs. Then we will be asked to justify those beliefs, and so on. If in the course of justifying our beliefs we refer back to some belief we have already been asked to justify, then we will be involved in circular reasoning. If, however, we never refer back to a belief we already have been asked to justify, then we will be involved in an infinite regress. None of these are satisfactory. A fideistic belief is by definition unjustified and does not differ epistemologically from its antithesis.
I think we need to look up the word fideistic. I don't know what that word means.
Okay, let's see. A fideistic. I think it's just faith-based. Reliance on faith alone.
Okay, there we go.
Reasoning and philosophy of reason.
Mr. English is my second language here, trumping me on vocabulary.
A fideistic belief is by definition unjustified. I had actually 7 years of Latin or so maybe that's why. A fideistic belief is by definition unjustified and does not differ epistemologically from its antithesis. If we think it does not have an epistemic advantage over its antithesis, then that advantage could be offered as a justification. But at that point, we're on our way to circularity or an infinite regress.
Okay, and then just to be clear, circularity, we know what that is. You get into a circular argument.
Yeah.
Infinite regress is you never actually get to something that explains what's going on. It's
right.
turtles all the way down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
An infinite regress is not satisfactory. To say that the justification for a given belief finally comes at the end of an unending series of beliefs is simply to obfuscate the fact that the belief in question is never justified. Consequently, an infinite regress is just another fideistic belief and suffers its same fate. Circularity is also not satisfactory because it is much more interesting. Advocates of a philosophical position called coherentism think they have beaten the foundation dilemma. They point out that beliefs do not neatly divide into the categories of foundational beliefs and justified beliefs. All our beliefs are related to one another in the form of a coherent web. Some subset of our beliefs may be more important and juridical than other beliefs, but all beliefs hang on all other beliefs and nothing is foundational.
So there's no bottom.
Right. There's no reasoning from the ground up. It's more like it's big, everything's related.
So I guess kind of a web where the web exists because all the points are interconnected, and if you remove a point, the whole thing breaks, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as Michael DePaul in his article Coherentism points out, coherentism really doesn't escape the foundational problem at all. It is simply another version of foundationalism that holds all beliefs to be foundational. He says regarding the coherentist solution to the problem of circularity, but coherentism seems to be a non-starter, for if no belief in the chain is justified to begin with, there's nothing to pass along. Altering the metaphor, we might say that coherentism seems about as likely to succeed as a bucket brigade that does not end at a well but simply moves around in a circle. The bottom line is this: we must determine our criterion of justification prior to determining our criterion of justification, so that we can use it to determine our criterion of justification. If we recognize this as a problem that is in principle unsolvable, we will save ourselves considerable time and headache by not chasing solutions that appear to work only because they have first obfuscated the problem. Nicholas Everett in his book Modern Epistemology says of the current state of analysis that this search for foundations has been unsuccessful. It has failed in mathematics and it has failed in science. All particular proposals have failed, and it fails in principle. Everett concludes with the question, given this inevitable failure, what, if anything, is left for epistemologists to do?
So basically, the author of this paper is giving examples of people attempting to deal with the fact that both the pathway down rationalism and the pathway down empiricism lead us to places that aren't very useful. How do we grapple with it? And some people try to say, okay, well, here's this thing called coherentism, and then oh, here's this other thing over here. And he points out that even these are still committing the same errors that we ran into in the first place.
All right. Skepticism. As we've already seen, the foundationalist can provide no justification for his belief in causality, identity, externality, and self. But the skeptic would give these problems a little more emphasis and draw our attention to a few more problems. External world. We've already seen from Berkeley and Hume that man cannot justify belief in the external world. Immanuel Kant said it was one of the greatest scandals of science and philosophy that there was no proof for the existence of the external world, because we can make no distinction between our internal world of thought and the external world. We cannot know that what we call the external world is not just a form of our internal world. Therefore, we cannot know that the external world even exists. Again, this is not we're not arguing this. We're just laying out where this journey leads you. Mm-hmm. Willard Van Orman Quine admits physical objects are conceptually imported as convenient intermediaries, comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer.
What a dork. Go ahead. Continue.
For my part, I do believe in physical objects and not in Homer's gods. But in the point of epistemological footing, the physical objects and the gods differ only in degree, not in kind. I mean, what does this mean?
He's making fun of the state of epistemology of this rationalist versus empiricist stuff.
Empiricist, yeah. So we get all kinds of sensations around us, but if we ground everything only from the bottom up, then we are.
Well, we cannot differentiate from real things and things that are made up like Homer's gods.
Right. So we're using the sensations as justification for the existence of an external world, but that it's faith-based, essentially. That's what he's saying. It's epistemologically equivalent to the gods of Homer. The self. We should also make a few more observations about our notion of the self, because this has been the autonomous man's most confident assertion. Ever since René Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, man has at least been confident of his own existence. But what precisely does the term self refer to? What are you? Are you simply a dream, an idea in the mind of a god or a demon? Are you a program on magnetic tape, as an old Moody Blues song suggests? Are you simply the nexus of ideas, as David Hume suggests? Are you material, spiritual, abstract, or concrete? Whenever autonomous man says his self exists, he has some metaphysical notion behind the term that he cannot justify. But if no given notion of the self can be justified, then no content can be attributed to the notion of the self. We are confident in the assertion, I exist, only to the extent that it is completely without content and meaning. This is why Cornelius Van Til refers to the cogito as a rock in a bottomless sea. Yes, it is a rock, but it rests nowhere, can do nothing, and means nothing. So, I mean, this to me, like in my philosophical journey, as an amateur, I have to admit I was impressed by Descartes' foundationalism. Because sure, right. So what Descartes did, and I remember reading his book back in high school. I think. Yeah, philosophy class. I think it was philosophy or whatever, some class. But I was like, whoa. So he stripped away all these things that are uncertain. He said, well, at the very least, I know that thinking is occurring. This is also Sam Harris and people like that. Go back to this. So I've stripped it all down. I've taken it to the very basic, raw fact of, I think, therefore I exist. I'm making no assumptions, right? Except you're making a gigantic bucket list of assumptions when you make the statement.
Right.
Like, can you think of any assumptions? I mean...
Yeah, I think, therefore I am. Oh, I am what? In where? Right? Okay, I think, therefore I am. Is there some construct of reality that I'm assuming is here just because I'm thinking?
So first of all, he assumes that language has meaning.
Right.
By stating that sentence. He implies that there's meaning to words and letters. he implies that there is a thinker, that there's a knower, and that there's such a thing as being. I think, therefore I am, existence. He steals the concept of logical induction, by the way. Therefore, right? That is a
Yeah.
so-and-so,
Yeah.
and therefore so-and-so. He assumes time, because I think, and then that means that I am. So throughout this short time period that I formulated the sentence, there's some kind of connection between what was before, what comes after. There's all kinds of transcendental concepts that Descartes assumes without going from the bottom up, right? So
Yeah.
that's something that I never thought about back, when I read this. But it's something I've just come across recently, and I think it's a good point.
Maybe it's better to say, I think, therefore there's something going on that I got to figure out.
Sure, but then still,
and I'm not saying that that's a foundational statement. I'm saying that's what we start with. And okay, I'm gonna get some occult stuff here. You ever read Aleister Crowley's The Book of Lies, or tried to peruse it? You have any idea what I'm talking about?
I mean, I know who Aleister Crowley is. But I
Okay,
haven't
so
read the book.
he's got this book called The Book of Lies, which is it's so fucking weird and bizarre. It's apparently a commentary on Kabbalistic numerology, and he has these things that are kind of quasi poems that are totally weird, and then he's got a commentary which sometimes helps and sometimes doesn't on each poem. And the beginning of the book, he's got 3 pages. The first page, it just has a 0 in the middle of it. The second page has a question mark, and the third page has an exclamation mark. And this, he at some point later in the book, he says this is some sort of Kabbalistic commentary, right? But it's essentially this is our starting point, which is there's nothing. You kind of open your eyes, and then you look around. There's some confusion, like there's senses coming in, and I'm thinking, what's all this stuff? And then there's shock. Whoa! There's something here, and I control it, and I'm in this world of things I could touch and move around and experience. Right? That's the starting point.
Right.
I think therefore I am describes that starting point.
Yes.
It doesn't describe a foundational
Well, and it's
concept.
Right. It's critical. I mean, the fact that is the most basic thing you could whittle it down to, and yet you have to assume a whole bunch of
Right.
things that must have come to you somehow. It must have been given to us. We are confident. Okay,
Switch
we
over.
had that reliability. Oh yeah, the reliability of the senses. Autonomous man also cannot justify the belief that there is a sufficient correspondence between the way the world appears to him and the way the world really is. In fact, the world can appear to us only as the senses present it to us. But we already know that our eyes do not see the full spectrum of light, nor do we know if objects in the world have properties, maybe essential properties, for which we have no corresponding sense.
This is super important. This also gets me too, and just the literal example that he just gave, which is our eyes do not see the whole spectrum of light. So we're now, through the revelations of science within the last, 150 years or so, we're now aware that there's light outside of the realm that which we could see. So what that means is before that, we had no idea that there was this entire electromagnetic world affecting everything going on. And we built our understanding of the universe based on the fact that we didn't know all this stuff. Now we've expanded our understanding of the electromagnetic world and said, "Oh my God, there's so much more here that we didn't know." Well, what else do we not know that we haven't sensed yet?
I mean,
Yeah, right?
there are creatures that don't have vision, for example, right? So
Right.
it's not a ridiculous question to ask. What if there's some organs that we lack that prevent us from perceiving certain things? Like, for example, imagine there's people who couldn't smell. How do you explain the concept of smell
Yeah, I can't do it.
to someone like that, right? So, moving on here. The world. the world, but we already know that our eyes do not see the full spectrum of light, nor do we know if objects in the world have properties, maybe essential properties, for which we have no corresponding sense. Why should we think of our five senses detect even a small percentage of the range of properties that exist in the world? We do know that the sonar of bats, the stereoscopic eyes of man, and the compound eyes of flies all project very different images. Each gives sufficient information for survival, but which should be taken as normative? How do we know any of them are sufficient to enable us to even engage in an analysis of the possibility of empirical justification? But even if our senses were reliable, after the work of Hume, Kant, Wittgenstein, Quine, and all the coherentists, we know that all experience is sufficiently theory-laden, that it is not rational to simply assume a close identity between reality and our perceptions of it. Even if it is a fact that all minds impose the same structures on the world, causing all our experiences to be uniform, that does not, as some have suggested, give us objectivity. Rather, it precludes our ability to contrast our experiences and get behind our mental structures to the real world. So, in other words, the fact that we all have the same sensation makes it even worse. It doesn't give us any sense or concept of this whole notion that our senses might be
Right. Well, we believe our own
deluding us.
bullshit easier, basically.
Exactly. As Richard Rorty aptly puts it, since the truth is a property of sentences, since sentences are dependent for their existence upon vocabularies, and since vocabularies are made by human beings, so are truths. If at bottom vocabularies really are made by human beings, then Rorty is right. The inductive problem. The autonomous man cannot justify his habit of making inductive generalizations. Hume argued that inductive generalizations are not even probable.
Well, and then, sorry, quick interruption here. Induction basically is the creation of universals.
Well, induction
Logically
means
speaking.
Induction versus deduction, right? So induction means you make an observation in reality and you deduce from that a theory, whereas deduction is purely logical, deducing from logical principles alone, theoretical principles alone. So he argues that inductive generalizations are not even probable. No number of particular instantiations of an event can justify a universal description of that event in all places and all time. Hume points out that for one to argue that induction is even probable, they would also have to make the case for causality and the uniformity of nature.
Right.
Bertrand Russell expresses this problem well when he says, what these arguments prove, and I do not think the proof can be controverted, is that induction is an independent logical principle incapable of being inferred either from experience or from other logical principles, and that without this principle science is impossible. Imre Lakatos says, one can today easily demonstrate that there can be no valid derivation of a law of nature from any finite number of facts. But we still keep reading about scientific theories being proved from facts. Why this stubborn resistance to elementary logic?
He's hammering the point in.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah.
We'll get to it. Now, Karl Popper also thought that Hume's arguments against induction were insurmountable. So he advocated the abandonment of induction and proposed his theory of falsification as an alternative. But this doesn't solve the problem of justification at all. First, it abandons the possibility of finding a proposition that is positively indicated and justified for the exceedingly weak possibility of a mere guess being corroborated by our failure to falsify
So,
it.
and just to, again, take this out of the philosophy babble, is this Karl Popper guy is essentially coming up with this idea to say, okay, well, if we can't prove anything, but we could disprove stuff. And so we'll disprove things. And I mean, this is how science works, right? We could never prove anything, but we could disprove stuff. And if there's 10 options and we disprove 9 of them, we just have to assume the 10th one's true.
Right. For example, if I let go of this cup, it's going to fall to the ground. But does that mean that the next time I let go of this cup, the same thing is going to happen? I mean, I guess so. Yeah, it makes sense. I can't falsify the theory. So Popper says, well, if you can't falsify the theory that the cup falls to the ground, then it becomes an ultimately incontrovertible principle.
Right.
However, why?
Well,
What's the basis of that? What's the basis? So now the lack of falsifiability, which means that there's truths and falsehoods, which once again assumes language, assumes all these huge things, has become the ultimate pillar of, empirical autonomous man reasoning from the ground up.
It reminds me of something. When I was in college, I had this professor that nobody liked, but he did say one thing to me that has stood with me for a while. I had to give a presentation on some lab that we did for physical chemistry, and it had to do with first-rate and second-rate reactions, which nobody has to understand what those things are. But we did this test to determine whether this reaction was first-rate or second-rate. And I got the data and I did the math, and I said, this proves that this is. I don't remember which one it was. This proves that this is a second-rate reaction. He said, no, you can never prove anything. You just disproved it's a first-rate reaction. And I think that's the proper way to address science, for sure. But in terms of the metaphysics and stuff, that what Nima's pointing out, or what this guy's pointing out, it is that the falsification, I guess, like my professor said, you can use the falsification, but it doesn't prove what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right?
And it may seem...
Go ahead.
It may seem nitpicky for us to use the example of a cup falling down and whatnot.
Yeah.
Because, obviously, that's probably some of the highest certainty levels we have. But this problem becomes so apparent and relevant when you start noticing how scientists apply this concept to all kinds of much softer sciences.
Right. Because
now they create some sort of experiment with an entire system of variables surrounding it. And for example, let's say we test the efficacy of a vaccine. How about that? Which vaccines are, of course, all safe and effective, and they work great.
We're on YouTube. They're perfect, wonderful, amazing.
So scientists have, not all scientists, but these kinds of scientists have this faith in the methodology of falsification, the methodology of, well, if we repeat this experiment 100 times, it must be true. It may seem ridiculous to nitpick at that when it comes to gravity. However, it shows us why science has become so incoherent today. It's like they apply the same principle. Well, we've repeated this experiment on 100 people, and so it must be universally true for all times, for everything, everyone. Well, maybe with the cup, that is a good guess, probably a reasonable assumption to make. It's helpful.
But if you have free will actors, you can't necessarily do that, which I guess alludes to a little bit of what we said at the beginning. We were talking about Charles Merriam, and if our Illuminati overlords can turn our higher functionings off, we kind of turn into these automatons, right? So they're trying to force their math to work.
Exactly. And that now you understand. Now we understand why they are so keen on transforming the human mind into an incoherent, philosophically inept mind.
Because then their math works, and I guess they're rationalists like Pythagoras, and they can't handle the fact that reality might not. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yep.
Given our ability to, first, it abandons the possibility of finding a proposition that is positively indicated and justified, for the exceedingly weak possibility of a mere guess being corroborated by our failure to falsify it. Secondly, given our ability to manufacture secondary hypotheses to protect a beloved hypothesis from falsification, no proposition can ever be clearly falsified. Thirdly, even if some counterexample to one's favorite theory could be produced, since one's theory exists as part of a larger web of beliefs, one may give up some other belief in the web rather than the theory that might have been falsified. For example, let's take the old story of the man who thought he was dead, but agreed that dead men don't bleed. I could prick his finger, cause him to bleed, and then offer that fact as proof that he's still alive. However, he could logically respond that I did nothing more than refute the notion that dead men don't bleed. So, if this does not exemplify today's state of science.
I got to rephrase that. So basically he's saying, I said dead men don't bleed, and I'm dead, and you prick my finger, and you say, see, you're alive, and you go, no, I'm still dead. You just proved that dead men can bleed.
Right, exactly.
Right. So, I mean, we would call this the moving goalposts fallacy. Right.
Or how about the completely theoretical idea that the vaccines are safe and effective, and then people start dying after taking the vaccine?
Which it hasn't actually happened. We're just
No, of course.
hypothesizing that in a world where that would happen. Yeah.
Then it's just happened because of climate change.
No, no, Nima,
Right?
Nima, it actually happened. This is the official line. It actually happened because some people think that that's what's happening, and that's what's causing the people to die. Not the vaccine itself, but the people criticizing the vaccine. Get it right.
That's the latest cope. It's literally you caused anxiety in people, and so their heart rate went up and they died. Lakatos explains the problem with falsification. He says scientists have thick skins. They do not abandon a theory merely because facts contradict it. They normally either invent some rescue hypothesis to explain what they can call a mere anomaly. If they cannot explain the anomaly, they ignore it and direct their attention to other problems.
And this is why science moves at the speed at which scientists die.
Yeah. That reminds me of the Pfizer executive in the congressional hearing talking about, well, why did you not test the vaccine before you rolled it out? Well, we were moving at the speed of science. Whatever that means. That was her cope. Newton's science.
It's not a cope. We're on YouTube. That was perfectly true.
That's her.
Yeah.
That is the true reason that she discovered, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Newton's science, for instance, is not simply a set of 4 conjectures. The 3 laws of mechanics and the law of gravitation. These 4 laws constitute only the hard core of the Newtonian program. But this hard core is tenaciously protected from refutation by a vast protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses. Now, Newton's theory of gravitation, Einstein's relativity theory, quantum mechanics, Marxism, Freudianism are all research programs, each with a characteristic hard core stubbornly defended, each with its more flexible protective belt, and each with its elaborate problem-solving machinery. Each of them, at any stage of its development, has unsolved problems and undigested anomalies. All theories in this sense are both refuted and die refuted. Without justifying inductive generalizations, scientific conclusions cannot be reached, and universal propositions cannot be made. The uniformity of nature. Now, universal propositions also make claims about all future instantiations of the subject. But this is only so if nature is uniform. An autonomous man cannot demonstrate the uniformity of nature. He can argue that the future will be like the past only if he already knows that the future will be like the past.
Right. So we get into circular logic again.
Yeah.
Basically.
Bertrand Russell explains it well. It has been argued that we have reason to know that the future will resemble the past because what the future has constantly become what was the future has constantly become the past and has always been found to resemble the past. So that we really have experience of the future, namely of times which were formerly future, which we may call past futures. But such an argument really begs the very question at issue. We have experience of past futures, but not of future futures. And the question is, will future futures resemble past futures? This question is not to be answered by an argument which starts from past futures alone. We have therefore still to seek for some principle which shall enable us to know that the future will follow the same laws as the past.
I'm translating philosophy babble here so we don't fall asleep. Basically, things are consistent. Well, how do you know? Because in the past we've seen that things are consistent. Well, how do you know the future's not going to be different? He's saying, well, we have to have we need some explanation for that. That has to come from somewhere else.
Well, if we are to be autonomous men, right, we have to have some explanation for this. Because otherwise we're taking the concept that future futures will be like past futures on faith. And taking things on faith is bad because we're rationalistic and empiricists and we're not theists. We're not superstitious idiots who believe in God.
Right. And then, just to be clear, when he says autonomous man here, he's referring to a man attempting to interpret the universe without the aid of God. That's what he means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, without justification of the uniformity of nature, no scientific generalizations can ever be justified. The deductive problem. Without justification for induction for the uniformity of nature, no universal propositions can be justified. Without universal propositions, man cannot make use of deductive reasoning. Logic. Autonomous man can make no direct case for the validity of logic. He cannot say what logic is. Is logic a substance, a property? Is it concrete and particular, or is it abstract and universal? What is it and where is it? This problem is particularly difficult for materialists. Not having a category for non-material universal entities, they often suggest that logic is merely a convention. This, of course, makes it arbitrary and destroys its universality. Metaphysics and logic are very closely related. Do we know a priori that Eastern monism is false? If not, then possibly all is A and there is no non-A. But if there is no non-A, then are the laws of excluded middle and non-contradiction meaningful? How do we know a priori that the monists are wrong? Monism is
Everything is
suggests
one.
that everything is one. Yeah. At the end of it all, there's no separate entities. In which case, he's also... So, do we a priori know that Eastern monism is false? If not, so maybe monism is true, then A equals non-A, and logic collapses.
It's irrelevant, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. How exactly do we know that all reality must conform to these principles we call logic? How do we know that there exists in the world some universal principle that says, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, that he absolutely must be mortal? Can inductive or deductive references be marshaled on behalf of logic? We have already seen that the case for these principles themselves cannot be made. More to the point, induction and deduction are methods that presuppose logic, and therefore any direct case for logic is necessarily involved in circular reasoning.
So I think he's going to get to his theistic point here soon. It sounds like he's starting to
well, yeah, I mean,
come to
we
a
still
conclusion
get
on this point, yes.
Yeah, we're going to get through pragmatism, I think, still, and then, yeah. One may be tempted here to respond that because no counterexample can be imagined, the universality of logic is undeniable. But does the mere fact that we are psychologically so disposed that we cannot think of the world in other than logical categories justify us in concluding that the world is bound by these categories? Why should we think our psychological limitations are descriptive of the entire universe? A psychological inability to modify the way we think about the universality of logic does not prove it is in fact universal. It merely means we cannot modify the way we think about it. If we cannot answer these questions, what are we reduced to? Many of us consider logic to be the bedrock of our worldview and our theory of knowledge. But what kind of a foundation is this? Do I say, I don't know what it is, I don't know why I believe it, and I don't know if it always applies, but it is the solid foundation on which everything is built?
Which I will interrupt here and say that is better than the purely empiricist or the purely rationalistic argument. Peanut gallery talk here. Go on.
I mean, that's as good as it gets, basically, for them.
Yeah.
We're not trying to refute logic. We're merely pointing out the inability of man, unaided, to account for something so central and basic to the knowing process. You see, none of these foundational notions are meaningful or are justified individually. Rather, they all find their meaning in a worldview that is itself justified. These problems and others are what I refer to as the jumpstart problem. How do we jumpstart the foundations of our epistemology? At this point, it becomes clear that autonomous philosophers have been reduced to wild guesses as to their foundations. Most people hold to all the above listed beliefs, but they do so as articles of faith, not justified beliefs.
Well, in this, I guess this leads into the, maybe he'll mention it down here lower, that I'm sure you've heard the argument that, atheists have faith, they just have faith in something else. Well, this is the something else that they have faith in. Yeah.
Given the problems discussed thus far, many contemporary philosophers such as Nietzsche, Quine, Rorty, Unger, Harman, Lehrer, and others have become skeptics as to the possibility of objective truth. According to Richard Boyd, the consensus among philosophers of science is that foundationalist conceptions of knowledge in general and of scientific knowledge in particular are untenable. Rather, they have given up on the possibility of truth in any traditional sense. And this is now how we get to pragmatism. Because of the failure of foundationalism and because of the success of science, science has become the contemporary paradigm for epistemology. Utility has become the modern-day criterion for truth. If it works, it's true. This pragmatic theory of truth, first advocated by Peirce, James, and Dewey, looks to a proposition for its cash value. This theory has been advocated most effectively in our time by some of the most important philosophers of our day, such as Sellars, Popper, Rorty, and Quine. Rorty says, for the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality, and so there is no need to worry what sort of reality, if any, a given sentence
sorry, this just drives me nuts. Where it's like, okay, here's this little nuance, so therefore forget reality. Like they're just so ready to jump to that conclusion.
Right,
I mean, so ready to jump to that conclusion.
They're ready to jump to anything other than God, basically.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how ridiculous, faith-based, superstitious, complicated, ridiculous it becomes. It corresponds to no need to worry about what makes it true. Sorry, let's start. For the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality, and so there is no need to worry what sort of reality, if any, a given sentence corresponds to. No need to worry about what makes it true. He drops the notion of truth as correspondence with reality altogether and says that modern science does not enable us to cope because it corresponds, it just plain enables us to cope.
Well, and then going back to science here, remember that, I mean, again, based on what I said about my experience with that professor, where he said, you can't you can't prove anything, you can only falsify stuff, and we just went over why that's not a basis for an understanding of reality. Yeah, it's useful in the realm of science, but it's not a basis of reality. And pragmatism is pointing out here, well, because we've gotten rid of everything else, the only thing we have left is science, which we already have shown fails as a comprehensive explanation.
Yeah. You can't make any true statements, you can only falsify. Okay. Did you just make a true statement?
Right. Well, you can't falsify it, so let's continue. No, I'm just pretending to fight. Please continue.
This approach to truth should hardly need a rebuttal. The pragmatic project is to identify what language, games, and forms of life will best enable a given agent to achieve his desired goal. This might be an interesting project in itself, but its pursuit demonstrates the complete failure of autonomous man to make any objective sense out of life, reason, and experience in any type of normative descriptive sense. Man has not won the game of knowledge. He finally realized he could not win and found a new game to play. And I think this is also goes nicely hand in hand with all the word games that we experience in today's insane world. I mean, the COVIDian insanity.
Flip us over.
What was it?
To put us back up, so we're chatting.
Oh yeah.
Let's see how beautiful we are.
Oh yeah. Well, so he predicts here. I mean, this was written in 2000, or even I think original copyright 95. But he predicts here a lot of the craziness that is coming to a head today, where the words that are presented to us by authorities define the conversation about such things as, for example, an infectious disease. Right? Now, flashing big numbers on a screen, on corporate media screens, has now become incontrovertible evidence for people that there's an unprecedented infectious disease spreading.
Right.
I mean, just to illustrate how detached from anything foundational this kind of approach is. It really becomes a language game. And by the way, they also say cash value is a consideration. And have we not seen companies raking in insane amounts of cash?
Right. If it makes money, it's good. Well, I should say if it makes money, it's true, and good or bad of it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add to this because I keep reading E. Michael Jones' book on economics. Again, I'm about 1,000 pages into it, which means I have a good full length novel left to read. But the more I keep reading and the more I think about it, and it's a lot to read. And E. Michael Jones, I love listening to him, but I do feel like he has a hard time making his end point clear. So you really got to think about what he said. And maybe that's intentional, but that the foundation of economics really comes from Isaac Newton, who borrowed his who got his functional idea from alchemy, which comes from Empedocles, something like that, from ancient Greece, who was an alchemist, that basically said, all reality, all motion is a conflict between love and strife. And this turned into gravity and inertia. And on that alone doesn't mean too much, except when you extrapolate what this means philosophically, is that by doing this, Newton created a universe that became devoid of meaning. Right? I mean, this is the kind of the basis of the empiricist argument, at least in modern times. Is that now we have the scientific proof and explanation that stuff just moves and there's no meaning behind anything. It's just a bunch of particles smashing together, and because we have an attractive force and a repulsive force, a balance gets created between these things, and everything just works itself out. Adam Smith turns around and takes this idea and applies it to economics, and this is similar to what you were saying before. It's one thing to say these things about natural hard sciences. It's another to take it over to soft social sciences that now include people making individual decisions. But it creates what E. Michael Jones calls the, in quotes, capitalistic universe, and I hesitated to say that word without giving any sort of indication of what I mean behind it, because capitalism has really become a really loaded term. But it creates this capitalistic universe where everything is a cash transaction. And because everything is a cash transaction, and this cash transaction models what Newton created, which is, instead of gravity and inertia, which is our love and gravity's the love, the inertia is the strife. I think I have that right. Yeah, because gravity is attractive and inertia is the repulsive force. We now have competition and self-interest. Competition is the strife, and the self-interest is the love. And this created an economic model that said, okay, if we leave things alone, in quotes, which means not have government interfere with anything, that the balance between economics, the balance between self-interest and competition will create an equilibrium where moral questions solve themselves. Mm-hmm. Right? Which, and I mean, this is pretty indifferentiable from the modern libertarian view of economics. Right?
It's the Randian view.
The what?
The Randian view.
The Randian view too.
Rational self-interest. Everyone's individual rational self-interest. When people pursue their individual rational self-interest, they make everything great for everyone.
Right, and then even if what they're not doing is great, there's this thing called competition, which acts as the balancing force. So ultimately everything works out in the end, as long as you don't have government taxing things and causing inflation in the middle. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the argument. Well, this comes from an interpretation of Adam Smith's economic universe, which is an attempt to copy Isaac Newton's physical universe, and the invisible hand is supposed to be this we want to talk about believing in God without believing in God, right? This invisible hand, which is like, okay, what is the invisible hand other than some sort of divine actor, right? Well, if we recognize that the invisible hand is a divine actor that doesn't really exist, and we see that going back to what we're reading now, that we get into pragmatism, and for most philosophers, this comes into a proposition of cash value. If it makes money, it's true, and I guess, therefore, by consequence, good. This is all downstream of taking meaning out of the universe from the Newtonian cosmology. Did I connect those points clearly enough to understand?
Yes. Another observation I would add is if we want to chat economics a little bit, I would say the rationalist, foundationalist approach, a rationalist, empiricist, foundationalist approach, the autonomous man approach to philosophy, is paralleled in economics by the barter theory of money
versus the credit. That's an interesting point. Barter theory versus credit theory.
Yes, because the barter theory starts from the ground, from the very basic individual, because that's really all there is ultimately, is individuals acting, I mean, according to that theory, individuals acting with each other. We go to the foundations, and on that same token, in the realm of philosophy, the empiricist goes down to the individual and what they're observing, tries to build a system of epistemology from there.
Well, and Andy says, well, I can only work with this stuff around me, which is the barter, the physical things that I'm bartering, yes. That's a very interesting observation, as opposed to the credit theory, which starts up here. Right?
Yeah. And even more so the state theory of money, which says that the existence of money presupposes a state. In the realm of philosophy, you could say, well, the existence of meaning presupposes a deity.
God. Yeah. Well, and I mean, depending on how much you read into the history of money, you might even say money presupposes a religious order, because fundamentally I mean, from the anthropological evidence, money was associated with bringing tribute to temples.
Yeah.
From the beginning. Now, whether that was the first state or the state took it from there, it's another conversation we can have another day. But money was intrinsically linked to religion at some point. And I think that is a very well put corollary.
But man cannot win the game of pragmatism either. For even though he is not playing the game of knowledge, he will still need to provide an unattainable criterion for determining who are the proper agents and what is the proper goal. Only when these choices have been made can man invoke his science and ingenuity to decide what is the most efficient means for the chosen agent to achieve his chosen goal. As Dr. Bounson summarizes, this is a very important paragraph, I took a note here. We must press on and ask critically about the rationality or the arbitrariness of our choice of goals. We can grant the superiority of science's problem-solving tools only after we are convinced science is dealing with the right problems in the first place. So then, why should our goal be that of coping with the environment instead of the alternative, perhaps more weighty aims of a mystical union with nature, interpersonal rapport, appreciation of beauty, and on and on? What justifies the particular goal chosen by the empirical scientist? Perhaps that goal is simply arbitrary, consequently reintroducing relativism and skepticism into science. So here I think we come to the point where it becomes really relevant. And all this theoretical nitpicking, some people might call it, up to now, I think it really finds relevance in this observation, because isn't that the absolute state of science today? How do scientists know that they're dealing with the important things, with the important issues in our lives? How do they know that? How do they know how to prioritize the things they do? Why are they dealing in 17-dimension string theory and gene therapy injections into the body that produce this or that result, metaverse, and all these things that they're doing, are these important questions that are these the important problems we need to solve to get to achieve more meaning in our lives, or to achieve a better life, whatever that may be. And what even is meaning? What is the right and the wrong choice? Because we've given up the philosophical aspect of goodness and value and meaning, and we've delegated that to science, but science has no answer for these things. Now scientists have free reign to do whatever makes the most money for this or that mega corporation, basically.
Or what actually gets us the government grant, because governments only hand out grants if you find this result. So we better find that result, or we won't get the money.
Yeah, I mean, speaking completely hypothetically, of course, because none of that has happened over the past 2 to 3 years, right?
Never.
They didn't just predetermine the results of their supposed tests and experiments, and then roll out a giant cash-generating project that, by the way, hurts a lot of people. But I guess if there's no good and bad, if there's no meaning, if good and bad is defined by the stock price of Pfizer Inc., then it all makes sense, right? It all suddenly makes sense again.
Right. I'm really looking for. I keep bringing up SMBC Comics. I'm looking for one right now that again just hits this perfectly. I can't find it, but I think I can describe it well enough. There's a guy standing in front of a group of scientists, and he's saying, "Please stop thinking about what you could do and think about what you should do." And he I mean, this is kind of referring to the trope of like the evil scientist looking into things that are really probing the essence of morality when they should be thinking about that, and they get in this argument of going, well, I'm a scientist, I explore where I need to explore, and I don't think about such things like that, right? And so this guy standing on the stage is addressing this group of scientists like this, and one of them raised their hand. He's like, we actually don't do either of that. All we do is just focus on research for grant funding.
And I mean, there's people like, the pop scientists, like Bill Nye, the science guy.
Bill Nye, the dickwad with his mechanical engineering degree. Him? Yeah.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, they actually literally tell people, don't look into philosophy. It's all gibberish, it's all nonsense. Well, because they don't understand any of these problems.
To their credit, sometimes you dive into philosophy and that's what you find. Like, if you dive into philosophy without a coach, that's pretty much what's going to happen. Like there's just so, like, of all the pool of philosophy, like 90% of it's filth. And if you just dive in, you're probably going to dive into some filth. So I will say I do see where they're coming from saying that, even though it's wrong, but I feel for them.
Well, it's I do see what they're saying, is because it would destroy their foundations and their belief system. I mean, to the question of what should we do, somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson can only say whatever we say.
Right. We determine that. Yes.
Whatever the consensus of all the people I disagree with already is, that is what we should do. So basically,
you mean the people I agree with already?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically,
disagree. Yeah.
Okay. You basically reduce the complex questions of metaphysics and epistemology to whatever we say. That's the grand result of thousands of years of science and autonomous man reasoning. It's fallen back on, I guess, a philosopher king kind of situation.
Right.
No, now, to avoid arbitrariness and question begging, an external justification of the chosen goal becomes necessary, forcing the pragmatist to go outside his epistemology and to naturalize his procedures. So in other words, we've now made the scientific method we're replacing all justifications of all empiricism, all rationality, by the scientists doing experiments that work, whatever that means. But
right, which again kind of leans into the Newtonian universe that just kind of acts on its own and has no meaning or moral sentiments to
well,
it.
it deifies the scientist to an extent, because so now for the pragmatist, he has to go outside his epistemology and to naturalize his procedures. This justification will be descriptive in nature, claiming that a given agent, the scientist, succeeds in getting to his given goal if he adheres to a given method. Now, when the agent is an individual and the goal is dictated by self-interest, epistemology is naturalized or reduced to psychology, which is what you find in Quine's article Epistemology Naturalized, and in Piaget's Genetic Epistemology. If the agent is the species, and the goal of science is the survival of the species, epistemology is naturalized into biology, which is what you find in Popper's Objective Knowledge and Stephen Toulmin's Human Understanding. If you take the agent as a social class, the goal as its domination over other classes, epistemology reduces to sociology or history, as in Marxist epistemology. As you also find in the sociology of knowledge, when the agent is seen as a culture with the goal of serving its conventional aims, epistemology is reduced to anthropology, which is what you find in Winchie's book, The Idea of Social Science. The trouble with all of these naturalizing epistemologies, which reduce to one branch of descriptive science or another, is that they answer the request for justification of science by simply skirting it. So this goes into the problem of, okay, if science is and pragmatism and what we do, whatever works, becomes the thing, then we still have human beings with individual desires and individual actions involved in making these pronouncements and going through these experiments, achieving, as he says here, achieving his objective by adhering to a given method. Science gives neither rational nor pragmatic justification for its practice. In fact, Everett points out in his analysis of Quine's Epistemology Naturalized that since Quine is not concerned about the existence of the external world, but only about the psychological processes that exist between the data a person receives, the input, and their view of the world, the output that is produced as a result of the data, naturalized epistemology is not dealing with the same question as traditional epistemology, and is therefore may not really be epistemology at all.
Bam! In your face.
Yeah.
Gotcha!
So, conclusion. The epistemological dead-end view of history is not just the speculations of a committed Christian. Richard Porte similarly summarizes history. He says that once upon a time we felt the need to worship something which lay beyond the visible world. Beginning in the 17th century, we tried to substitute a love of truth for a love of God, treating the world described by science as a quasi-divinity. Beginning at the end of the 18th century, we tried to substitute a love of ourselves for a love of scientific truth.
Well, and then just to interrupt you really quickly, this goes back to something I said right when we started this paper about deism, because deism is this idea, God creates the universe and then he just lets it go by himself, or lets it go by itself, which was the Isaac Newtons and the John Locke's and all these guys were deists, basically. Thomas Paine. And I think we see a lot of this science reaching a divine aspect, because at least these people at this time, and of course this is a different interpretation from what we have now, by probing into the secrets of the universe, they felt that they were getting a connection to God because they were understanding God's creation better. Which I don't have any problem with that sort of interpretation, but we could see if you remove God from that equation, then the science itself becomes the thing of worship.
And if the science becomes a thing of worship, it becomes a cash proposition. It becomes a free-for-all, right? It becomes the tool of the social manipulator, of the behavioralist, of the sociologist, of the input-output automaton observing scientist, basically. And I think this may also explain why people are being turned into such automatons again, like we discussed earlier, right?
Well, I think we're getting assaulted from all angles to be turned into automatons. This is just one of them.
Yeah. He goes on to suggest that we try to get to the point where we no longer worship anything, where we treat nothing as a quasi-divinity, where we treat everything, our language, our conscience, our community, as a product of time and chance. Cornelius Van Til points out that this world of chance that Rorty endorses is at the heart of the non-theistic worldview. This world of chance is in stark antithetical contrast to the intentional worldview of Christianity. It is in this intentional world alone that the world, man, and reason are connected. It is in this intentional world alone that truth can exist and in which any theory of knowledge must take place.
Okay,
The very
pause.
notion-
I want to say something here, which is as someone raised in a Protestant tradition. This didn't come to me until I was much older. That in the Protestant tradition, the Bible falls out of the sky, and that's the Word of God, and that's the end of it. And
Sola Scriptura.
yes, and frustratingly enough, everybody gets to take small quips, single verses or half verses out of the Bible and use those to explain things completely divorced of any context whatsoever, which is perfect for manipulating whoever you want to manipulate. Because I mean, out of a 2,000-page book, if you're allowed to just take whatever piece you want from the void, you can just prove whatever you want at any time, right?
Well, it says what it means, and sorry, what did they say? It means what it says, and it says what it means.
Oh, yeah,
right? There's no such thing as interpretation. There's no such thing as imperfect humans reading and interpreting.
And the fact that humans arranged the books, and there was one human that actually removed some of the books from the Bible, Martin Luther at one point, right? But what I'm trying to get at here is that so when we kind of look at the early history of what would happen, so Christ comes, he gets crucified, raises 3 days, goes to heaven. These apostles are left over. Saint Paul Saul of Tarsus enters the picture, and we get the book of Acts. And Acts is this description of basically what did the beginnings look like after Jesus left the picture. And one thing that I found very interesting now that I've started looking at this with either a Catholic or an a non-Protestant view, basically, is that Jesus gave this much information. If you look about it in terms of what he actually said in the gospel, and then from there, the followers have had to infer aspects of reality. They say, okay, if Jesus said this, and this is true, well, what does this mean about that? Right? And a lot of what we understand as Christianity is a result of those discussions. And I mean, in fact, when you look at the books of the New Testament after the Gospels, a lot of this is like Saint Paul working out like, okay, well, the Torah says this and Jesus says that, so therefore this is the interpretation that we need to have of those things. That was I mean, at least according to these books, Paul describing that, not Jesus. It was Paul figuring it out from what was taught from Jesus, right? So the point that I want to make here is that this entire idea of logic and universals and these pillars of philosophy, they didn't fall out of the sky kind of like the Protestant version. There were some fundamentals that come from Jesus, and then thinkers had to get together and figure it out. And they had to figure it out, and they took into account, okay, well, there's God, and we have faith, and he created the universe, and his son came on earth, and there was divine revelation, and there was prophets, and they said these things. Based on these as our fundamental examples, what do we extract from here? The scientific method gets extracted from there. Logic gets extracted from that. I mean, I know Aristotle starts it, but the Christians take it and go with it, and they end up with the scientific method, right? So, I mean, even the fact that like when we look at the assumptions that we have that are getting ignored by these various philosophies, they're the assumptions that have been injected from Christianity. That they then turn around and say, okay, no, those aren't there. Or excuse me, Christianity's not there anymore, but they walk along with the assumptions that were brought from Christianity, right? And they didn't fall out of the sky like the Protestant version. I mean, some of the revelations in quote fell out of the sky, but they had to be processed by the Christians that came after.
Yeah. This is the challenge of Scripture alone. You're
One of the
basically-
challenges.
Yeah, you're eliminating a tradition of thousands of years of complicated discussions and debates and redebates and re-debates and just starting from scratch for no particular reason other than political.
And then they're not starting from scratch, right? Because the Bible's not scratch. The Bible didn't come around until 400 years after the fact or whatever, right?
Well,
At the
also,
Council of Nicaea.
Right, and Luther saying something is also not from scratch, right? So just because Luther said that thing, said that we have to interpret the Bible alone and not fall back on thousands of years of debates. Why? Why is that?
Right.
What's the justification for doing that versus doing your best to trace back to the beginning of time, or the beginning, at least to the revelation that came from God?
Well, and then even St. Paul alone, he always bugs me. St. Paul always bugs me. If Protestantism is true, you should throw out St. Paul, because he never met Jesus. Okay, he gets this vision of Jesus saying, "Stop persecuting me," but he doesn't get instructions from Jesus, at least according to the books, according to the Bible. So if we're saying Scripture alone, then St. Paul shouldn't have any authority to write anything any more than a later church father, right? Because the Protestants don't recognize any of these later church fathers in their writings. So why would you include St. Paul in the Bible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're getting sidetracked.
yeah.
Keep reading.
Cornelius Van Til points out that this world of chance that Rorty endorses is at the heart of the non-theistic worldview. This world of chance is in stark antithetical contrast to the intentional worldview of Christianity. It is in this intentional world alone that the world, man, and reason are connected. It is in this intentional world alone that truth can exist and in which any theory of knowledge must take place. The very notion of philosophy and science as descriptive endeavors presupposes that man and the various objects of the world are all united in a relationship essentially as outlined in our first story. It presupposes that behind everything is a unifying entity. Thus, traditional philosophy and science are theistic concepts.
Right, so this is the atheists still have a god sort of argument. Right. And it's kind of along with what I just said is that,
No.
Sorry. Go ahead.
But what he's saying is that traditional philosophy and science came out of theology.
Right, like I just, similarly to what I just described, yes.
Exactly. Rorty himself acknowledges this point. He says the very idea that the world or the self has an intrinsic nature, one which the physicist or the poet may have glimpsed, is a remnant of the idea that the world is a divine creation, the work of someone who had something in mind, who himself spoke some language in which he described his own project. Only if we have some such picture in mind, some picture of the universe as either itself a person or as created by a person, can we make sense of the idea that the world has an intrinsic nature. What is Rorty saying here? He's saying that the idea of truth as a description of the nature of the world is meaningful only if the world has an intrinsic nature. But the world does not have an intrinsic nature if everything is what it is by chance. In a chance world, the properties of a thing are not connected or united to one another.
Yeah, it's just billiard balls bouncing around.
It is infinitely improbable that any two entities will share the same property or any two properties share the same entity purely by chance. So in other words, we have different kinds of trees that share property with different kinds of plants, beings.
Well, I got another chemistry story here. So when I was taking physical chemistry, which is basically quantum mechanics or quantum physics when you're taking chemistry classes, we had a statistical part where we were looking at, okay, if and we're starting with like gases. If we have gases and there are all these balls bouncing around, and if you've got a cubic piece this big, there's 5 quadrillion molecules of air inside this cubic piece, how do you like statistically address that sort of relationship? And I remember discussing. I remember the professor discussing like this is the type of math that's used when people look at the life must have come from the primordial soup model, where somehow in the early stages of Earth, when there was first water, amino acids must have accidentally formed. And then those amino acids must have accidentally combined, reacted with each other to make proteins, which, is the basis of the first life, which led to the first bacteria. And the math which describes that, like the probability of that happening is so infinitesimally small. It's like, how could this have possibly happened? And when I was a kid, I remember if you discuss life on other planets, they look at this and they go, there's a good chance we're the only thing in the universe, because this is like fucking impossible that this actually happened. And even if you multiply it across the entire universe, the chance was so small that it's just there's a good chance there's no other life in the universe. Which to me is self-evidently a little weird, because if you look around at the vibrancy of life and the veracity which it tries to perpetuate itself and grow everywhere, if it was just so not only did we have the accident that it formed in the first place, but there was also the accident that it was formed with this veracity to continue perpetuating itself. Mm-hmm. Man, that's a stretch.
What was it?
I said, man, that's a stretch to believe.
Yeah. If we just look at things like beauty, music, logic,
the accidental view cannot address that whatsoever. It can't understand it at all. It can't understand morality at all. As we've been...
Well, values, exactly, morality, good and bad. And the trouble that an empiricist or rationalist, any foundations, will always run into when entering this kind of debate is that they cannot explain why the debate has meaning, why they're even debating something. Why are you even here? How are you invoking grand metaphysical and epistemological concepts such as logic, such as induction, causality, the meaning of language and meaning in and of itself? These are all, going back to Randian terminology, these are all stolen concepts. That you're just, giant, huge concepts that you're just trying to leap across and then claim that you started with some the most basic, raw, factual foundations.
Right.
It's like there was a debate recently between Sam Harris and a theist, and I think it was a theist, but definitely. So Sam Harris is still struggling with this question, right? Because Sam Harris I think he's pretty much a materialist. He's a neuroscientist, but he's definitely a materialist, and his infancy level philosophy is pretty much exposed when he says things like, because the guy was asking him, well, how do you determine what's value, what's good, what's bad? Sam Harris's best shot was, well, I think values have to start with preventing bad things happening to a lot of people.
Well, why are those things bad?
Right? Well, why are things bad? Exactly. Why are those things bad? Who says so? It's like, well, I just don't want mass murder. Well, what if there's 51% of the world, and what if 51% of the people are sadists? They're going to enjoy mass murder and all these kinds of things.
Right.
Does that make it right? Well, I guess in Sam Harris's world, you kind of would.
Well, that immediately jumps to a pragmatist argument, right?
Yes. It would be actually a peaceful world with everyone living in harmony would be a complete disaster in that kind of world. What about all the poor sadists? Where do they get their kicks?
Right.
You know. So yeah. But yeah, it basically goes back to pragmatism. Yeah.
Please continue.
Let's go back to share. He's saying that the idea of truth as a description of the nature of the world is meaningful only if the world has an intrinsic nature. But the world does not have an intrinsic nature if everything is what it is by chance. In a chance world, the properties of a thing are not connected or united to one another. It is infinitely improbable that any two entities will share the same property or any two properties share the same entity purely by chance. Only if an entity has in back of it something by which its possible states of existence are limited, is there a limit to its possible states of existence. Our unifying descriptions of a chance world are fictions. It is only if everything is what it is, not by chance, but by intention, that our unifying descriptions of the world can be true and meaningful. Rorty correctly sees that such an intentional world is the world that belongs to our first story. It is a world that came forth from the mind of a divine creator. This theistic story is the precondition not just for truth, knowledge, and the intelligibility of experience, but for metaphysics as well. Rorty has inadvertently given us here the transcendental argument for the existence of God and the truth of his revelation. So what's the transcendental argument for the existence of God? It's basically what we just kind of...
Well, and then let's read the next paragraph because it looks like Karl Popper gives a good explanation of the transcendental argument.
Yeah. Karl Popper gives a good explanation of the transcendental argument. He says an argument which appeals to the fact that we possess knowledge or that we can learn from experience, and which concludes from this fact that knowledge or learning from experience must be possible, and further, that every theory which entails the impossibility of knowledge or of learning from experience must be false, may be called a transcendental argument.
Interesting.
It's a pretty, I think that's a little more complicated than I would have described. I would say we know this. We know something that's like a transcendental argument in the realm of just pure metaphysics and logic. You know, the kind of argument that axioms are based on, for example. An axiom is a statement whose validity you are affirming in the process of trying to disprove it. I'm not saying that axioms are the end-all be-all or whatever. This is just to the empiricist, the rationalist, the non-theist. This is the basis of all knowledge. It goes back to axioms, which are self-evident. For example, Aristotle said once, debating logic, if somebody trying to refute logic will have to use logic in the process,
right,
to refute logic, so he affirms logic. Now, what the theist would say in response is, but what is the basis for self-evidence? What is the basis for performatory contradiction? Mm-hmm. How is that ultimately true? So, and transcendental argument basically says that if you engage in a debate, you accept a whole bunch of concepts that you cannot account for empirically or rationally, such as, like we've discussed throughout all this, the idea of causality, the idea of existence, the idea of the self, the idea of knowing and knowledge, the validity of language, the existence of meaning. I could go on and on and on. There's a whole array of things that that we accept in the process of trying to argue against the existence of God. And a whole a list of concepts that we affirm without any explanation for them.
Right.
And it just so happens that the theistic worldview does give you an explanation for these things. Such as, does external reality exist? Can I know about the external reality in my mind? Well, yeah, because God created the external world, and God, who has the perfect divine mind, created humans in his image
and gave you the ability to see it.
to
And
have
sense it. Yeah.
to have meaning, to have knowledge, to have language, to convey meaning, and so that's basically what I like the transcendental argument because it really is. It's so foundational, right? It's probably one of the best arguments for the existence of God that I've ever seen.
Moving on.
Okay, moving on. For example, we saw earlier that no direct argument can be given for logic. Yet, even if we cannot say what logic is, we're willing to give it up.
We're not willing to give it up.
We're not willing to give it up. For to do so is to unravel the entire fabric of epistemology. And this is exactly why we believe in it. Not because it is the conclusion of some inductive or deductive argument, but because it is foundational to inductive and deductive arguments. This is the strongest inference one can have. This is a transcendental inference. It is in this way we argue for God. What the history of epistemology teaches us is that man, without an epistemological jumpstart from God, without the revelation of God and the theistic worldview expounded in it, cannot know the nature of himself, logic, the world, universals, or how they are all or could be related. In short, he cannot attain a coherent theory of knowledge. Consequently, no beliefs can be justified, and no beliefs can attain to the level of knowledge. Therefore, because theistic revelation alone is the basis upon which knowledge is possible, it is the precondition for knowledge, and it is transcendentally and necessarily true. Autonomous man can use reason and his senses while denying belief in God, and can thereby do math, science, and manipulate the world around him. But he can give no account of reason and senses apart from God. Therefore, just as reason presupposes the actuality of logic, whether or not one believes in it, so reason presupposes the actuality of God and the truth of our first story, whether or not one believes in it. This being the case, all arguments are arguments for the existence of God, and no argument against the existence of God can be made. For in the final analysis, an argument against the existence of God is like an argument against arguments. It is when one realizes that it is not possible to give an autonomous account of knowledge at all, he comes to a crossroads. He must either maintain his epistemological autonomy and surrender to the most radical skepticism, or he must surrender his autonomy to the revelation of God, not as a conclusion that has met the standards of his epistemological criterion, but as the foundation and precondition of the epistemological criterion itself. Without a revelation from God, we cannot know that all the objects of the world are rationally related and that our attributes are appropriate to know it. So, what he means here is that to the empiricist who wants to reason everything from the ground up, from the most basic raw facts, he's going to tell you that this transcendental argument is insufficient because it takes a leap. It combines bottom up and top down, basically, right? But just because it doesn't fit his chosen criteria doesn't make it invalid. Right? I mean, that was something a leap from, because I come from an empiricist
Background.
I would say, probably, yeah. And so I was always looking for empirical proof for God. But the transcendental argument makes it unnecessary, basically. You may recognize this as a simple disjunctive syllogism. Given that knowledge is possible at all, theonomous epistemology and autonomous epistemology are antithetical systems. One must be true and one must be false. If one is false, the other is true. We have seen that in principle, autonomous epistemology is not possible. On this premise, all facts and all experience are unintelligible. Therefore, we must conclude that the precondition to knowledge, to science, and to philosophy is the existence of God and the veracity of his revelation. Ooh, lowercase his. One web of beliefs, one web of beliefs, his worldview, determines the meaning that he applies to an experience. One's web of beliefs, his worldview, determines the meaning that he applies to an experience. It is the foundation and the criterion by which he determines truth. But only if man's mind and senses are appropriate for discovering the world, and only if his interpretive scheme in his worldview is correct, can he attain to truth. But this is possible only if he is intended for this world, and only if his worldview comes from someone who is in a position to know. All other worldviews amount to nothing more than wild guesses and vain imaginings.
Strong
God is
statement.
proven.
Strong
God is
statement. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. God is proven not as the conclusion of rational or empirical theistic arguments, but as the very ground of argument itself. It is with this surrender to God's view of himself, the world, and ourselves that one can articulate a coherent theory of knowledge. God's revelation is not validated by some autonomous epistemology. Rather, our epistemologically is validated by the revelation of God and the story contained in that revelation. God's revelation is self-authenticating because by it everything else is authenticated. And I've seen even atheists like Stefan Molyneux admit that there's a lot of things in this world. Stop sharing. There's a lot of things that we can't explain on rationalistic, foundationalistic, and purely empiricist grounds. And the theist has the advantage that he can explain these things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to the empiricists, they're going to say, well, but he just took some story from top down and didn't reason his way to it. Yeah, but that is
how is he going to get there? Yeah. Well, that reminds me. I actually saw. I was watching this YouTube video about Hinduism, because Hinduism is a quagmired mess of fuckery that's impossible to understand. And strangely enough, the video was specifically addressing that and saying, here's why they do that and here's why it's good. So, this is also something I've heard Aleister Crowley allude to in his Book of Lies, which is that your reason and our capacity to reason works within a specific sphere, and it cannot access things outside of that sphere. And so Hinduistic tradition is intentionally contradictory in order for you to shut down your reason so you could get in a mystical state that's outside of it. Now, I'm not commenting on whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, obviously that translates into the occult well if Aleister Crowley is writing poems that create, cause contradictions, and then he has a commentary on the side of it saying, well, this is on purpose in order for you to shut down your reason so you can access these higher realms or whatever. But I do think it goes to the point what you're saying is that, there's these things that we can't touch with logic and reason. And how do we address those things outside of it?
Right. And
what I will throw a wooden shoe into the machine ring here, some sabotage. Side note, the root word of sabotage is sabot, which is a word which means wooden shoe, as in you throw a wooden shoe into the loom, mechanical loom, and that breaks it. Okay, so we've got this transcendental argument for God and this slew of arguments for why all the autonomous explanations of epistemology are bunk. And I know we said at the beginning we weren't going to address this, but why does that lend to one explanation or another of God being accurate? Right? So, can we deduce on our own, based on what we just went over, that, okay, we are unable to address this ourselves, therefore there must be some sort of divine? Autonomously, we could deduce that. Now, how do we then make the jump to say, okay, therefore this interpretation is correct of that divinity? And I'm not trying to answer that question here, but I think that's immediately what the next question is, if we accept the premise of what was put by this paper.
Yes, and that is a human scientific historical investigation essentially. And the thing is, for the theist, so if we accept the theist argument, we're in a pretty good position to move on from here, because we can say that God gave us logic, reason,
Well, and then
the ability
let
to
me
perceive the
sorry to
world
interrupt
through
you.
empirical.
Some aspect of divinity. Because we're now at this point we're assuming God. Is it gods? Goddess? Is there gender? Is there not gender? Right? There's all these things it could be. But I think based on what we just read, from the autonomous view, we can come to the transcendental epistemology. But so far we can't say much
Which is
about
the
it.
true revelation.
Yeah, and this is where the revelation comes in. Correct.
Right. But this is so that this is where the inquirer would use his God-given capacities of logic and reason and the notion of an existing external world and the notion of the possibility of knowledge inside of our heads. These are concepts that he accepts from this inquiry, that he accepts from divine revelation at the end of the day. But how do we now find out which is the true divine revelation? Well, it would have to be a divine revelation that answers these quandaries that we went through, and it would have to be one that is historically proven, that's archaeologically solid, that is historically documented. And which one that is? I mean, that is basically the next step. That is step 2 after grasping conceptually the necessity of the existence of divine revelation and divine creation.
Word. So let's end it there, Nima. We've been going for a long time.
Yeah.
That was fun, though.
Yeah.
So
it was fun, and if you've listened all the way through up to now, then kudos to you, because it's deep stuff, heavy stuff.
Yeah. Well, we did our best to lighten it up, but I mean there were some times in there that was still pretty heavy. So anyway, this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irida TV, which you can find at irida.tv. Please check us out. Follow us at the social media of your choice, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.